Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when the Soviet Union, the big red scary superpower that dominated your parents' nightmares, tried to update its operating system and accidentally deleted itself. Think of it as the world's worst group project, where the team leader Mikhail Gorbachev kept insisting they could still get an A if everyone just believed harder in the project, while 14 other members were actively lighting their own notes on fire and walking out of the library. It's the 1991 finale, and the unsubscribe button is getting hammered. We are, of course, going to oversimplify this geopolitical earthquake into a borderline offensive comedy sketch, because nuances for textbooks and we're here for the drama before the inevitable betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated, so the stage is set. It's 1990, bleeding into 1991, the Berlin Wall. It's graffiti-covered souvenirs in people's basements. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all of Eastern Europe has basically told Moscow new phone, who dis, and sprinted toward the West. The Cold War is supposed to be over. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man with the world's most famous birthmark, is the toast of the town. He's won a Nobel Peace Prize. He's buddies with Reagan and Thatcher. In the West, he's a visionary. Back home, not so much. At home, Gorbachev is the guy who promised a slick renovation and instead managed to knock out every load-bearing wall, unleashing a biblical swarm of termites. He had the big ideas, Glasnost, or openness, which was a revolutionary concept that meant people were finally allowed to say, hey, this entire system is a dumpster fire, and Perestroika, or restructuring, which was supposed to fix the dumpster fire of an economy. Spoiler, it didn't. Glasnost worked a little too well. People started talking. They talked about the decades of corruption. They talked about the historical atrocities Stalin tried to bury. And the 15 republics that made up the USSR, places like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and the Baltic states started talking about how much they hated being roommates with Russia. Perestroika was a catastrophe. Instead of creating a hybrid market socialism, it just broke the old command and control system without building a new one. The result was economic freefall. We're talking shops with nothing but shelves, lines for bread that looked like pilgrimages, inflation that made monopoly money look stable. Gorbachev had accidentally invented the "this is fine" dog meme in real life. He was wandering around a burning house, insisting they were just building socialism with a human face, while the face was actively melting off the skull. This created the perfect storm. The central government in Moscow was going broke. The people were angry and vocal, and the local republics were looking at this chaos and having a revolutionary thought. What if we just left? The cracks weren't just showing. They were full in canyons. The first and loudest were the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These three countries had been independent before World War II, until Stalin violently absorbed them in 1940 as part of his side deal with Hitler. They never considered themselves Soviet. They considered themselves hostages. And in March of 1990, Lithuania did the unthinkable. They just declared independence. Full stop. We're out. It's been real. Or mostly, it's been awful. Goodbye. This was the ultimate test. Gorbachev was now trapped between his screaming factions. On one side, you had the hardliners. These were the old-school Communist Party bosses, the KGB generals, and the military brass who still had posters of Stalin hidden in their offices. They saw Glasnost as treason. They saw Perestroika as sabotage. And they saw Lithuania's declaration as the first domino in the total collapse of their empire. Their solution was simple. Tanks. Send in the tanks. Show them who's boss. Remind them what 1956 in Hungary looked like. On the other side, you had the radical reformers and the nationalists. These people, ironically personified by Boris Yeltsin within Russia itself, thought Gorbachev was a spineless compromiser. He was too slow. He was still trying to save the Communist Party. They wanted to burn the whole rotten structure to the ground and start over. Gorbachev, bless his heart, thought he could talk his way out of it. He believed in the Union. He was desperately trying to get everyone to sign a new Union treaty. This was his pitch. Hey, guys, forget that old, oppressive, Stalinist Union. We're gonna have a new union. It'll be decentralized. It'll be voluntary. We'll all be equal partners. It'll be like a fun coup, but the republics weren't listening. They were already browsing Zillow for their own sovereign apartments. Let's trace the logic of this internal collapse. Cause Gorbachev's reforms loosened the centralized iron grip that had held 15 incredibly diverse nations together through fear and force. Effect: decades of suppressed nationalism, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic exploded into the open like a pressurized sewer main. Consequence: the republics, starting with the Baltics, began passing local laws declaring their own sovereignty, meaning their laws were now more important than Moscow's. This started a war of laws, a bureaucratic nightmare where nobody knew who was actually in charge. Can Russia tax this factory, or does the Soviet government? Does Lithuania's law beat the Soviet constitution? The entire chain of command that ran the country, from nuclear weapons to toilet paper distribution, was grinding to a halt. Gorbachev pleaded, he threatened, he offered compromises, he tried to sell his new Union Treaty as the only thing saving them from total anarchy. But Lithuania wasn't buying it. They had hit send on their independence declaration and were waiting for the world to recognize them. The hardliners in Moscow were polishing their boots. The year 1991 dawned not with hope, but with an agonizing, impending showdown. Gorbachev's new thinking was about to collide with old-fashioned brute force. This wasn't some polite suggestion. This wasn't a proposal tabled at a committee meeting. On March 11, 1990, the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet, led by a squinting, famously uncharismatic music professor named Vytautas Landsbergis, just did it. They voted to re-establish the independent Republic of Lithuania that had existed before Stalin ate it in 1940. They declared the Soviet annexation illegal, null, void, and a historical oopsie. They announced a new old constitution, a new old flag, and basically told the largest, most paranoid, nuclear-armed empire on Earth to get off their lawn. You have to appreciate the sheer, glorious, titanium-plated audacity of this. Lithuania was a nation of less than 4 million people. It was, at that very moment, occupied by tens of thousands of Soviet troops. The main KGB headquarters for the entire region was in their capital, Vilnius. They had no army. Their economy was completely welded to the Soviet grid. This was a hamster telling a grizzly bear that it was moving out of the cave, and also, the bear was trespassing. The world held its breath. What would Gorbachev do? This was the ultimate test of his new thinking. All his speeches in the West about a common European home and freedom of choice suddenly mattered. Was that all just marketing, or did he actually mean it? Gorbachev, trapped between his Nobel Prize and his own military, did what any stressed-out manager does when faced with an impossible crisis. He tried to bury it in paperwork. First, he convened the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies, which dutifully voted that Lithuania's declaration was invalid. He personally got on the phone and told Landsbergis to cancel his independence, like a parent telling a teenager to unslam their bedroom door. When Landsbergis politely replied, "Lol, no," Gorbachev went to phase 2, the economic blockade. If Lithuania wanted to be independent, fine, Moscow would show them what independent really meant. In mid-April 1990, Gorbachev turned off the taps. 90% of Lithuania's oil, gone. Natural gas, cut. Coal, vital raw materials, even spare parts for factories. The flow stopped dead. This was the empire treating a rebellious republic like a deadbeat roommate. You want to tear up the lease? Fine. Enjoy your cold showers and your non-functioning stove. Let's see how long your little freedom thing lasts when you can't fuel your tractors. This was meant to bring Lithuania to its knees in weeks. The hardliners in the Kremlin were giddy. This was a clean solution. No tanks, no blood, no angry phone calls from George H.W. Bush. Just good, old-fashioned economic strangulation. But a funny thing happened. The blockade didn't crush Lithuania, it forged it. The medicamentary here is just delicious. The Soviets, the masters of the 5-year plan and centralized production, fundamentally misunderstood human stubbornness. They thought economics was everything. But when you tell an entire nation that you're starving them into submission, they don't just roll over, they get really, really angry and really, really creative. People shared fuel. They dug up old wood-burning stoves. They walked. They huddled. The suffering was immense, but it wasn't making them want to rejoin the USSR. It was reminding them exactly why they wanted to leave. Every cold night was another reason to hate the Kremlin. This standoff dragged on through 1990. The West made sympathetic noises but did nothing. They were terrified of undermining Gorbachev. They liked Gorbachev. He was their partner in ending the Cold War. They saw Landsbergis and the Lithuanians as inconvenient troublemakers. Poking the bear, everyone was trying to calm down. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground was getting tense. Let's run the logic. Cause Lithuania declared its sovereignty, invalidating all Soviet laws on its territory. Effect: this included the mandatory military draft. The new Lithuanian government told its young men not to report for duty to the Soviet army. Consequence: thousands of Lithuanian deserters fled the army and went into hiding, protected by their own population. Beat: this was a direct assault on the single most sacred institution in the USSR, the Red Army. The military brass was apoplectic. This wasn't about economics anymore, this was mutiny. Beat: in response, the Soviets started sending in military patrols to hunt for the deserters, storming hospitals and university buildings, effectively starting a low-grade military occupation against the illegal government. Gorbachev's soft blockade was failing. It was almost 1991. The hardliners were tapping their feet. They had been patient. They had let Misha try his little economic squeeze. It didn't work. The Lithuanians were still waving their stupid, illegal flags. The army was being defied. The entire empire was watching. If Lithuania got away with this, Ukraine would be next. Then Georgia. Then everyone. The soft hand had failed. It was time for the iron fist. In Moscow, the black Barrett's the Omen, or special purpose police units were given their orders. These were not peacekeeping troops. These were the Kremlin's brutalist shock troops, loyal not to Gorbachev's ideals, but to the old, hardline Ministry of the Interior. They were told that counter-revolutionary forces and nationalist extremists in Vilnius were creating a crisis. The calendar flipped to January 1991. The hardliners had decided to solve the Lithuania problem. The world was distracted by the run-up to the Gulf War. Maybe no one would notice. Gorbachev, to this day, maintains he didn't give the final order, but he had created the crisis. He had failed to resolve it, and now, the men who believed in nothing but force were taking matters into their own hands. The tanks, which had been sitting ominously in their barracks on the edge of Vilnius, began to warm up their engines. So, January 1991, the Gulf War is spinning up. All cameras are pointed at Saddam Hussein, and the Kremlin's old guard decides this is the perfect time to take out the trash in the Baltics. They figured, hey, the world is watching a real war. Who has gonna care about a little internal policing in some breakaway republic nobody can find on a map? They were wrong. Colossally, apocalyptically wrong. The operation started subtly, or as subtle as Soviet hardliners get, on January 8th. A National Salvation Committee, which sounds like a heroic rebel group, but was actually a puppet committee of pro-Moscow communists, declared it was the new, true government of Lithuania. Nobody had voted for them. Nobody knew who they were. They were the political equivalent of a 4chan user declaring himself king of the internet. But they had one thing going for them, the backing of the Red Army. That same day, Soviet military units started moving. They secured the main press and publishing house in Vilnius. You can't print your illegal independence newspapers, they argued, if we're standing on the printing press. Then, on January 11th, the Omen troops, the Black Berets, got busy. These guys were the pinnacle of Soviet terror Wedon law enforcement. They stormed the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense. They seized the main railway hub. They were grabbing key infrastructure, piece by piece, like a game of Risk played by thugs. The Lithuanians, led by Landsbergis, knew exactly what was happening. This was the prelude to the final decapitation strike. They knew the next targets would be the two centers of their resistance, the Parliament building and the TV tower. Landsbergis got on the radio and television, his voice cracking with urgency, and made a simple plea. Come to the Parliament. Come to the TV tower. Come and stand. They cannot shoot us all. And the people came. This is the part that the hardliners, with their brains full of tank columns and 5-year plans, could never, ever compute. Tens of thousands of regular people, grandmothers with thermoses of hot tea, students with guitars, factory workers, and poets left their homes and streamed into the freezing January night. They weren't armed. They didn't have a plan. They just showed up. They linked arms around the Parliament building. They surrounded the TV tower. They started singing. That was the weapon. They sang old patriotic songs, folk anthems, and hymns. They were going to bore the Red Army into submission. The hardliners were not amused. This was not in the manual. On the night of January 12th, the order was given. The objective, the TV tower. It was the main broadcast antenna for the entire country. Take the tower and you take the airwaves. You cut the head off the snake. A column of Soviet tanks, APCs, and a unit of the KGB's ultralight Alpha Group commandos began to roll. The scenes from that night are insane. You have this column of T-7 to tanks 60 tons of pure, cold Warending 3 trundling through the suburbs of Vilnius. And in front of them, unarmed people, chanting Lietuva, Lietuva, Lithuania, waving flags. Some of them literally just stood in the road, holding hands as if they could physically stop a tank with sheer moral conviction. The tanks didn't stop. They fired blanks first, concussion blasts so loud they burst eardrums, hoping to scatter the crowd. The crowd didn't scatter. Then they fired live rounds over the crowd. The crowd still didn't scatter. The tanks just kept pushing forward, crushing cars, smashing barricades, and horribly crushing the people who fell or wouldn't move. When the column reached the TV tower, the real horror began. The tower itself was surrounded by a human chain. The Omen and Alpha group commandos piled out of their APCs and just went medieval. They attacked the crowd with rifle butts, clubs, and live ammunition. They shot into the mass of people. They stormed the building, firing indiscriminately in the lobbies as they fought their way to the control room. 14 people were killed. Over 700 were injured. They were shot, beaten, or crushed by tanks. One of the victims was a 21-year-old woman named Loretta Asanavicuta, who fell under the tracks of a T-72. The metacomentary here is just blindingly obvious. This wasn't a police action. This was a massacre, and it was the single stupidest, most self-destructive PR move the dying Soviet Union could have possibly made. They didn't just fail to scare Lithuania into submission, they created 14 martyrs and broadcast their own brutality live on the air until the moment a soldier burst into the studio and the screen went dead. They proved in blood exactly why the Lithuanians were so desperate to leave. Let's do the chain reaction of stupidity that led to this moment. Cause the hardliners decided they needed to end the Lithuanian independence charade with a decisive show of force. Effect, they chose a military solution, sending tanks and elite troops against the civilian target, the TV tower, that was being defended by unarmed citizens. Consequence, the operation turned into a bloody fiasco, killing 14 and wounding hundreds, all in front of rolling cameras. Beat, instead of breaking the Lithuanians' will, the massacre galvanized their resistance and united the entire nation against Moscow. Beat, the graphic images were smuggled out and shown across the globe, instantly destroying Gorbachev's human face of socialism image and horrifying the West. The tower was taken. The broadcast was cut, but the hardliners had lost. The next day, 500,000 Lithuanians, more than 10% of the entire country's population, gathered in Vilnius for the martyrs' funeral. The parliament building, which the army never took, another column of troops apparently just lost its nerve and stopped, was now surrounded by a sea of people and concrete anti-tank barriers. Gorbachev was toast. He tried to distance himself, claiming he was asleep. Nobody told him it was all the local commander's fault. It didn't matter. The blood was on his hands. He had either ordered it, or he was so irrelevant that his own military was committing massacres without his permission. Either way, he was finished, and a man in Moscow, who had been watching this all very closely, was about to make his move. The blood was barely dry on the pavement in Vilnius, and the international headlines were radioactive. Gorbachev, the West darling, the man who ended the Cold War, was suddenly looking like a classic Soviet thug. He was backpedaling, live on TV, claiming he was in his pajamas and didn't know anything about it. Tanks. What tanks? My generals would never do that without asking. It was pathetic. It was transparent. And it was the single greatest political gift Boris Yeltsin had ever received. Cue Boris. If Mikhail Gorbachev was the smooth, calculating, university-educated reformer trying to finesse the system, Boris Yeltsin was the exact opposite. He was a big, loud, silver-haired Siberian brawler, a populace who knew how to drink, how to bellow, and most importantly, how to hate, and he hated Gorbachev. He saw him as a weak, indecisive talker, a man still desperately trying to apply CPR to the corpse of the Communist Party. Yeltsin, you have to remember, wasn't just some random guy. He had clawed his way up to be the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic. That's right, he was the president of Russia, which was just one, albeit the biggest of the 15 republics. Inside the USSR, Gorbachev was his boss, the president of the whole Soviet Union. This created the most gloriously dysfunctional office rivalry in human history. It was like the CEO of the entire corporation, Gorbachev, being constantly undermined by the massively popular, slightly drunk manager of the flagship New York branch, Yeltsin. And the New York branch manager just saw the CEO light the Vilnius branch on fire. Yeltsin didn't. Wait, he didn't form a committee. He didn't draft a memo. He pounced. The instant the news from Vilnius broke, Yeltsin smelled blood. He saw Gorbachev, stained and stammering, and realized the throne was open. He immediately flew to Tallinn, Estonia, another one of the Baltic states that was, understandably, having a full-blown panic attack. He stood in front of the world's cameras, not as a Soviet official, but as the leader of Russia. He didn't just express concern, he condemned the attack. He called it a monstrous crime, an act of violence by a reactionary center against the sovereign will of a free people. This was the pivot. He was positioning himself and his Russia as the protector of democracy. He was the real reformer. Gorbachev was just another weak dictator in a long line of them. A man who talked peace in Paris and sent tanks to Vilnius. Let's trace this political judo. Cause the Soviets centered Gorbachev's government, or the hardliners he couldn't control used brutal, Stalin-style force in Lithuania. Effect: this act of violence instantly discredited Gorbachev's entire socialism. With the Human Face Project, consequence: Boris Yeltsin, his primary rival, seized the moral high ground, framing the conflict not as USSR versus Lithuania, but as tyranny versus democracy. Beat. Yeltsin then issued a revolutionary statement. He called on all Russian soldiers who were, of course, the bulk of the Soviet army to remember their consciences and refuse any illegal orders to fire on unarmed civilians. Beat. This was it. This was the shot. The president of the Russian Republic was openly encouraging mutiny within the Soviet army. He was drawing a line in the sand and telling every soldier, every citizen, and every bureaucrat, you have to choose. Are you with the old, bloody, dying Soviet Union? Or are you with the new, free, democratic Russia? The medicamentary here is just chef's kiss. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a sickle. Russia, the nation that was the empire, the republic that had dominated and oppressed all the others for 70 years, was now being repositioned by Yeltsin as the leader of the decolonization movement. He was effectively trying to get Russia to secede from the USSR. It was a move so audacious it broke everyone's brain. How can the core leave the apple? Gorbachev was checkmated. He was now fighting a two-front war on his right. The hardliners were furious that the Vilnius attack failed, and that he was too weak to finish the job. On his left, the Democrats, with Yeltsin now as their undisputed champion, were screaming that he was a bloody-handed tyrant. Yeltsin had successfully turned the Lithuanian tragedy into a referendum on Gorbachev's legitimacy. And Gorbachev was losing, badly. This forced Gorbachev's hand. He was losing control of the narrative, the army, and the republics. He had to prove he was still in charge, that someone in this crumbling empire still wanted him. He had to prove that the Union was still a viable idea. So, he did what all desperate leaders do when they ray losing the argument. He called for a vote. A big one, the first and only nationwide referendum in Soviet history. The question was simple. Or so he thought. Do you want to preserve the Soviet Union? He was sure that people would say yes. They'd be scared of the chaos. They'd choose the stability of the old empire over the terrifying unknown of Yeltsin's populist anarchy. He would finally get the popular mandate that Yeltsin was always rubbing in his face. This vote would shut Yeltsin up and bring the republics back in line. It would save his new Union treaty. It would save him. The vote was set for March 1991. It would be the answer to everything, unless, of course, the people gave the wrong one. So, Gorbachev, the political grandmaster, is now cornered. His hardliners think he's a weakling. The reformers, led by Yeltsin, think he's a tyrant. The economy is in the toilet. The republics are staging a full-on mutiny. He needs a win. He needs a mandate. He needs to prove to everyone, Yeltsin, the West, his own military, and probably himself, that the people still want the damn Union. His solution, the most gloriously stupid, bureaucratic, and passive-aggressive political tool ever invented, a nationwide referendum. On March 17, 1991, citizens across 11 time zones were asked to go to the polls and answer one simple, just kidding. The question was a masterpiece of please, like me desperation, a three-letter monstrosity of indecisive gobbledygook. Get this. The question on the ballot was, do you consider it necessary to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedom of an individual of any nationality will be fully guaranteed? My God, let's just unpack that. It's not a question. It's a trap. It's for questions smooshed into one yes. Do you want to preserve the old thing? Hardliners, yes. Do you want a renewed federation? Gorbachev, yes, please. Do you want equal sovereign republics? Reformers, well, yeah. Do you want rights and freedom? Everyone, duh, who votes against freedom? It was a political Rorschach test. You could see whatever you wanted in it. A yes vote could mean you wanted the old Stalinist empire back, or it could mean you wanted Gorbachev's new, fuzzy, decentralized coup. A no vote meant, what? Exactly, that you were against human rights, that you hated equality. This, right here, is the meta-commentary on the entire Soviet collapse. The system was so broken, so fundamentally dishonest, that it couldn't even ask a simple question. It couldn't just ask, do you want to stay in the USSR, yes or no? Because they were terrified of the answer, they had to bundle staying in with getting human rights. As if the two were a package deal you could only get from the Kremlin. It was the political equivalent of a clingy ex texting you. Do you agree we should preserve our beautiful relationship as a renewed partnership of the sovereign individuals who will be guaranteed pizza on Fridays? If you say no, you're the monster who hates pizza. The reaction was, predictably, a complete circus. First, the outright boycott. 6 of the 15 republics took one look at this nonsense and went, yeah, we're not playing. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova. They just refused. They didn't print the ballots. They told their citizens the vote was illegal. Their logic was simple. You can't ask us if we want to renew our membership. We already canceled our subscription. The one you made us sign at gunpoint in 1940. This is spam. This was the first devastating blow. Before a single vote was cast, Gorbachev's nationwide referendum was already a fraud. It was a World Series with only one league, but the most high stakes. Fortuitous move came from the man himself, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin didn't boycott. Oh no, that was too simple. He saw Gorbachev's referendum and decided to hijack it. He went to the Russian parliament and said, great, we love voting. The people of Russia are definitely going to vote. But you know what? While they're in the booth, let's add one more little question. Just for us. Just for Russia. His question was a dagger. It was, do you consider it necessary to introduce the post of president of the RSFSR Russia to be elected by direct popular vote? Boom. Let's trace this brutal cause and effect. Cause, Gorbachev, desperate for a mandate, calls a convoluted referendum to save his new union and his own job as Soviet president. Effect, 6 republics boycott, instantly invalidating the Ilunian result. Consequence, Boris Yeltsin, his rival and Russian leader, adds a second question to the ballot inside Russia, the most populous republic. Beat. Yeltsin's question is simple, brilliant, and aimed directly at Gorbachev's weakness. Should we get to elect our own leader and not have one appointed by the Communist Party? Like Gorbachev. Beat. The referendum becomes a two-horse race. Gorbachev is asking for a vague yes to a vague idea. Yeltsin is asking for a specific yes to his empowerment. The results came in, and on the surface, Gorbachev won. Across the 9 republics that did vote, 77.85% of voters ticked yes. Gorbachev was ecstatic. See, they love me. They love the union. 78%. It's a landslide. But it was a phantom victory. It was like boasting about being the most popular guy at a party you threw for yourself, where 6 of the most important guests refused to come, and then there was the other result. The one from Yeltsin's question. In Russia, over 71% of voters said yes to creating a new, directly elected Russian presidency. This was the real outcome of March 17th. Gorbachev had spent all his political capital on a vote to preserve a dying entity. Yeltsin, with one clever move, had just won a popular mandate to create a new one. He had just been given the green light by the Russian people to build his own, separate, democratic power base inside Gorbachev's empire. Gorbachev thought he was asking the country if it wanted to stay together. What he got was a hollow sure, whatever from 9 republics, a go to hell from the other 6, and a resounding yes, please, from Russia for the one man who was actively trying to tear it all down. The referendum didn't settle the war of laws, it just gave Yeltsin a new, much bigger gun. The election for this new Russian presidency was set for June, and everyone in the world knew exactly who was going to win it. So, Gorbachev is waving his little piece of paper, his 78% yes vote from a party that half the guests skipped, yelling, see, the union is saved. And Boris Yeltsin, standing in the middle of Russia, just laughs. He laughs, cracks his knuckles, and gets back to work tearing the whole building down, stud by stud. The March referendum, for Yeltsin, wasn't a victory for the union. It was a green light from the Russian people to continue his hostile takeover of the union. He now had a popular mandate. The people didn't just vote for his new presidency. By extension, they voted for him, for his agenda, and his agenda was simple: Russia first. This is where the war of laws explodes from a bureaucratic squabble into a full-blown constitutional crisis that paralyzes the largest country on Earth. You have to understand the setup. It's gloriously stupid. The Soviet Union USSR was the big umbrella country, the Russian Republic. Our SFSR was the biggest state inside that country. But here's the catch: the USSR government, the all-powerful center, was the Russian government for decades. Moscow was the capital of both. The Kremlin housed both. The two were so intertwined. They were indistinguishable until Yeltsin, as chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, had already started this fight back in 1990. His parliament had passed a declaration of state sovereignty that politely suggested Russian laws might be more important than Soviet laws. But after the March 1991 referendum, Yeltsin dropped the politely, he dropped the might. He now had the will of the people, and he used it like a club. The Russian parliament, led by Yeltsin, just started passing laws, hundreds of them. They passed laws saying that Russia, not the Soviet Union, owned all the banks on Russian territory. Russia owned the mines. Russia owned the oil fields in Siberia. Russia owned the gold reserves. Russia would collect the taxes from every factory. Gorbachev, as president of the USSR, would issue a decree: the Union Ministry of Finance will collect taxes from the Omsk tractor factory as usual. The very next day, Yeltsin, as leader of Russia, would issue a decree: the new Russian Ministry of Finance will collect 100% of taxes from the Omsk tractor factory. Also, the Union Ministry of Finance is an illegal entity on Russian soil. Pay them and you're committing treason against Russia. Now, you're the manager of the Omsk tractor factory. What do you do? Who do you pay? This is the war of laws. It was a civil war fought with memos. It was the most destructive, passive-aggressive conflict imaginable. Cause, the Russian parliament, led by Yeltsin, declared the supremacy of Russian law over Union Soviet law. Effect, this created to rival competing governments. Russia and the USSR are trying to rule the exact same territory, from the exact same city, at the exact same time. Consequence, the entire state apparatus seized up. Who was in charge of the KGB? The Soviet KGB, or the new Russian KGB that Yeltsin was trying to create? Beat. Who did the army obey? The Soviet Minister of Defense, or Yeltsin. The leader of the land the army was physically parked on. Beat. The economy, already in freefall from Perestroika, completely disintegrated. There was no budget. The Soviet government was broke. Yeltsin was literally stealing Gorbachev's wallet, and the Russian people had just voted to let him. The metacomentary here is the sheer, mind-bending absurdity of it all. This was a country committing suicide by bureaucracy. Gorbachev was the landlord of an apartment building, the USSR. Yeltsin was the tenant in the penthouse, Russia, which also happened to contain the main fuse box, the water heater, and the lobby, and Yeltsin just declared, this penthouse is now its own sovereign building. Also, I'm cutting power and water to all the other apartments, which you technically still own, but which are physically located inside my new building. Good luck. It was a constitutional black hole. Gorbachev was checkmated. He couldn't send in the tanks that was his army, full of Russians, who had just voted for Yeltsin's ideas. And anyway, he just tried that in Vilnius and became an international pariah. He couldn't fire Yeltsin. Yeltsin was now more of an elected official than he was. All Gorbachev could do was what he always did: talk. He doubled down on his one, final, desperate hope: the new Union Treaty. He kept pleading with the republics, guys, please, just sign this new treaty. It'll solve the war of laws. It'll define who does what. It'll be a new, voluntary, decentralized union. It'll be great. He was like a startup CEO whose company is hemorrhaging cash, trying to convince his investors to give him one more round of funding, swearing the new business model will definitely work. Meanwhile, Yeltsin was preparing for the final kill shot. The referendum in March had created the new, powerful, shiny office of President of Russia. The election for that office was scheduled for June 12, 1991. This was the big one. This wasn't some convoluted committee vote. This wasn't an appointment by the Communist Party. This would be the first ever, direct, on a man-in-a-vote presidential election in the 100-year history of Russia. Yeltsin, the populist hero, the man who stood up to the tanks in spirit after Vilnius, the guy who was giving Russia its sovereignty, was the screaming hut favorite. The hardline communists fielded their own guy, a grumpy old apparatchik named Nikolai Ryzhkov. Gorbachev, pathetically, couldn't even find a credible candidate to run against Yeltsin. The war of laws had been the battlefield. The June election was going to be the coronation. It's June 12, 1991. Election day in Russia. And this is not your grandfather's Soviet election, where you get one name on the ballot and you vote DA, or you get a very nice vacation to a Siberian wellness resort. This is real. It's messy. It's loud. It is the first time in 1,000 years of Russian history that the people are picking their own supreme leader directly. And it is a total, unadulterated circus. The candidates. It was a rogues gallery. The main contender, of course, was Boris Yeltsin. He wasn't running as a communist. He had spectacularly, publicly quit the Communist Party the previous year, throwing his party card down on the stage in a mic drop moment of pure political theater. He was running as, well, as Yeltsin, the Democrat, the populist, the anti-establishment brawler who was going to give Russia its pride back. From the Donithing Soviet center, who was he running against? The Communist Party. The supposed leading force of the entire country ran Nikolai Ryzhkov. Ryzhkov was Gorbachev's former prime minister, an old-school bureaucrat whose main nickname was the Crying Bolshevik because he got weepy about the collapse of the command economy. He was the stability candidate, which in 1991 was like trying to sell relaxing vibes on the deck of the Titanic. And then, in third place, we got the debut of the man, the myth, the legend of political insanity, Vladimir Zhirinovsky. He was the proto-troll, an ultra-nationalist who was yelling that Russia should retake Alaska and Poland. He was loud, charismatic, and completely unhinged. And he still managed to pull in 6 million votes, proving that crazy has always had a solid market share. Gorbachev, the president of the entire Soviet Union, was so politically toxic he couldn't even endorse a candidate. He just watched, sidelined, like the unpopular kid at prom. As his chief rival prepared to be crowned king, the election was a blowout. Yeltsin crushed it. He won 57% of the vote on the first ballot. No runoff, no monolithic debates about who really won. The Russian people had spoken, and they had roared. This is the moment the entire axis of power in the Soviet Union tilted and broke. This, right here, is the metacometry that matters. Mikhail Gorbachev was never elected by the people. He was appointed. He was chosen by the Communist Party Politburo, a tiny cabal of old men in gray suits. He was general secretary. He was chairman. He was president of the USSR, a title the Soviet parliament had voted to give him. He had never faced a popular vote in his life. His entire authority came from the system. Boris Yeltsin, as of June 12, 1991, had just received 45 million votes from the Russian people. His authority came from them. The war of laws was over. The man with the mandate won. Let's trace the immediate consequence of this. Cause Yeltsin wins the first free, direct, competitive president election in Russian history. Effect, he now possesses a democratic legitimacy that is objectively, mathematically, and morally superior to his boss, Mikhail Gorbachev. Consequence, Gorbachev, the leader of the whole USSR, is now politically subordinate to the leader of one of its republics. Beat, Yeltsin no longer has to ask for sovereignty. He doesn't have to declare it. The people just gave it to him. He can now claim, correctly, I speak for Russia. Who the hell do you speak for? Mikhail Sergeyevich, the Communist Party you can no longer control. The 14 other republics that all hate you. Beat, the entire power dynamic is inverted. Russia is no longer the central pillar holding up the Soviet roof. Russia, under Yeltsin, is now the wrecking ball that has been democratically authorized to knock the whole house down. On July 10th, Yeltsin had his inauguration. It was a spectacle. It wasn't in the old Soviet Hall of Congresses. It was in the Russian Kremlin Palace. He didn't swear allegiance to the Soviet Constitution. He swore allegiance to the new Russian Constitution. He didn't put his hand on the works of Lenin. He put it on his own new reform program. Gorbachev was there. He had to be. He sat in the front row, looking like a man attending his own funeral. He watched Yeltsin take the oath, receive a blessing from the Orthodox Patriarch, another huge screw you to 70 years of state, atheism, and become, in an instant, the most powerful man in the country. Yeltsin had won. He was now Mr. President. And Gorbachev was just Misha. Gorbachev had one card left to play, and only one, the new Union Treaty. This was his last-ditch effort to save something. He'd been negotiating for months in a desperate process called the 9+1 talks him the 1 and the 9 republics like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, etc. that hadn't totally boycotted his referendum. He was trying to build a new, voluntary union. But Yeltsin's victory changed the math. Yeltsin, now President Yeltsin, showed up to these negotiations with a whole new swagger. He wasn't negotiating as a subordinate. He was negotiating as an equal. And meanwhile, in the smoke-filled offices of the KGB, the Ministry of Defense, and the Communist Party Central Committee, a group of men watched Yeltsin's inauguration not as a political setback, but as the final, unforgivable act of betrayal. They had watched Gorbachev let the Berlin Wall fall. They had watched him let Eastern Europe go. They had watched him fail to crush Lithuania. And now, they had just watched him sit there, smiling weakly, as this Siberian demagogue was legally and democratically handed the keys to Russia itself. They had seen enough. Gorbachev was a failure. Yeltsin was a traitor. The democratic path was a disaster. If the Union was to be saved, they would have to save it themselves, the old-fashioned way. So, while Yeltsin is taking his victory lap and Gorbachev is desperately trying to sell his new Union treaty like a man peddling a timeshare in a burning building, another group of men is meeting in the shadows. And these are not reformers. These are not Democrats. These are the guys who have Stalinists on their resume under special skills. They are the men who run the real Soviet Union. The deep state before that was even a phrase. Meet the Gang of Eight, or, by their much less catchy official name, the State Committee on the State of Emergency GKCHP. This wasn't some ragtag group of bloggers. This was the entire power structure of the old guard. This was Gorbachev's own cabinet. These were the men he had personally appointed, hoping to appease the hardliners, and who were now about to stab him in the back. Let's do a quick roll call of this supervillain team-up. You had Vladimir Kryuchkov, the head of the KGB, the entire KGB, the man who knew where every body was buried, because he'd probably put them there. You had Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, the guy with his finger on the button of the entire Red Army. You had Boris Pugo, the Minister of Interior, the boss of all the police and the Black Beret Omen troops who already had their dress rehearsal in Vilnius. You had Valentin Pavlov, the Prime Minister, the man supposedly running the entire Soviet economy. And for a cherry on top, you had Gennady Yanayev, Gorbachev's own vice president, the guy he depicted as his number two. These guys were joined by a few other fossils from the military-industrial complex and the Farmers' Union, but those five were the core. The KGB, the Army, the police, the Prime Minister, and the VP. The only person not in on the plot was, hilariously, Gorbachev himself. These men had been watching Gorbachev's reforms with mounting, apoplectic horror for years. They saw Glasnost as giving lunatics the keys to the asylum. They saw Perestroika as the deliberate, idiotic sabotage of their perfect command economy. They watched him let the Berlin Wall fall. They watched him applaud as all of Eastern Europe ran screaming into the arms of the West. They had tried to solve Lithuania, and Gorbachev had fumbled it, looking weak and incompetent. But Yeltsin's election in June 1991, that was the final insult. That was a traitor, a populist buffoon, being given a democratic crown inside their own capital, and then came the new Union Treaty. Gorbachev, in his infinite, naive wisdom, had finally cobbled together his masterpiece. He'd negotiated with Yeltsin and the leaders of 8 other republics the 9-1. The treaty was scheduled to be signed on August 20th, 1991. This treaty wasn't a renewal. It was a surrender. The Gang of Eight got their hands on a draft, and what they read made their blood run cold. Gorbachev, desperate to keep anyone from leaving, agrees to a new Union treaty that transfers massive power from the center, his Soviet government, to the republics Yeltsin's Russia, Kravchuk's Ukraine, etc. The treaty would effectively turn the Soviet Union into the Union of Soviet sovereign republics. It would create a loose, weak confederation. The republics would control their own taxes, their own natural resources, and their own laws. Consequence, for the hardliners, this was the death certificate of the empire. Signed in Gorbachev's own hand, the KGB would be broken up, the Red Army would be decentralized, the Communist Party would be just one party among many. Everything they had dedicated their lives to. The centralized, paranoid, all-powerful state was being voluntarily dismantled and handed over to nationalist demagogues like Yeltsin. The documentary is staggering. Gorbachev thought he was saving the Union by signing this treaty. The Gang of Eight knew this treaty was the very thing they had to kill. It was the final, unforgivable betrayal. It was Gorbachev, live on pay-per-view, handing the empire's nuclear codes to Boris Yeltsin and telling him to have fun. The plotting, which had been simmering since 1990, kicked into high gear. They held secret meetings at a KGB safe house. Kryuchkov, the spy chief, was the ringleader. He had his men bug everyone, including Gorbachev. They knew his every move. They knew that in early August, Gorbachev was planning to go on his traditional summer vacation. He was heading to his palatial presidential dacha. A dacha is a cottage, in the same way that Versailles is a house in Foros. On the Crimean coast of the Black Sea, he would be relaxed, he would be tanned, he would be completely isolated. And the treaty was set to be signed the day after he was due to fly back to Moscow. The timeline was set. The window was open. Gorbachev was about to take the most ill-timed vacation in human history. The Gang of Eight finalized their plans. They would wait for him to be hundreds of miles from Moscow, surrounded by the Black Sea, and then they would make their move. They would save the Soviet Union, even if they had to strangle it to death to do so. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's high summer, July 1991. Yeltsin has just been inaugurated president of Russia, and he's not just in the Kremlin. He's basically measuring the drapes and telling Gorbachev which furniture he's throwing out. Gorbachev, the man who is theoretically the leader of the entire superpower, is politically homeless. He's been humiliated. The hardliners hate him. The Democrats have abandoned him for Yeltsin, and the Republicans are ignoring his phone calls. He has one move left. One. It's the political equivalent of a Hail Mary, thrown from his own end zone, with 3 seconds on the clock, while his own offensive line is actively trying to sack him. It's called the New Union Treaty. This document was Gorbachev's baby. It was his obsession. It was the only thing, he believed, that could prevent the total, chaotic, every own Forthamzol's implosion of the Soviet Union. For months, he had been dragging the leaders of the republics to a government dacha outside Moscow called Novugaryovo. This was the 9+1 process, which stood for the 9 republics that were still sort of willing to talk, plus him, the one representing the central government that nobody wanted anymore. The 9 republics at the table were the big ones: Russia led by Yeltsin, Ukraine, Belarus, and the 5 big Central Asian republics: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. The 6 republics not at the table were the ones who had already hit unsubscribe and blocked the number: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova. They were done. They were not negotiating their renewed membership. They were busy designing their new passports. This whole negotiation was a masterclass in desperation. Gorbachev, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the global statesman, was reduced to a glorified wedding planner, begging a room full of squabbling, resentful cousins to please just agree on a seating chart so the whole family wouldn't collapse, and to get anyone to the table at all, especially Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev had to give away everything. The document they finally, painfully, hammered out was not a treaty. It was a suicide note for the Soviet Empire. The hardliners in the KGB weren't wrong about that. The draft of the New Union Treaty was a total surrender, to keep the republics, especially Yeltsin's Russia, from just walking away. Gorbachev has to make concessions. Effect, he agrees to a treaty that rebrands the country from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, to the Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics. Consequence, that one word, sovereign, changed everything. It meant the republics were now the masters. The treaty would hand over almost all power to the republics. They would get to control their own economies, their own natural resources, their own taxes. The central government in Moscow, Gorbachev's government, would be reduced to a tiny, federation-level entity in charge of, like, the military and a common foreign policy. Maybe, it was a total inversion of 70 years of history. Instead of a monstrous, all-powerful center dictating everything to its colonial puppets, it would be a group of independent states that voluntarily delegated a few minor tasks to a central office. The metacomentary is just magnificent. Gorbachev, in his desperate attempt to save the Union, had authored a document that legally and constitutionally ended it. He was trying to keep his job as emperor by signing a new constitution that basically made him head of the neighborhood association. Yeltsin, of course, loved this. He had negotiated Gorbachev into oblivion. This treaty was his war of law's victory, written down and signed. It would make his Russian presidency the real power and Gorbachev the ceremonial figurehead. He was all for it. The clock was ticking. Gorbachev, terrified the whole fragile deal would fall apart if he rushed to set a date. He needed to get this thing signed. The signing ceremony was scheduled August 20th, 1991. It would be done in stages. On August 20th, the first, most important group would sign: Russia, Yeltsin, Kazakhstan, one of the most powerful non-Russian republics, and Uzbekistan. Once they were in, Gorbachev figured the others would have to follow. In early August, the final draft was published in the state newspaper, Pravda, for the whole country and, more importantly, for the hardliners to see. There it was, in black and white. the complete and total dismantling of their empire. Scheduled for August 20th, Gorbachev, having set this ticking time bomb, promptly did the single most idiotic, tone-deaf, and self-destructive thing a man in his position could possibly do. He went on vacation. On August 4th, 1991, with the treaty set to be signed in just over 2 weeks, Mikhail Gorbachev boarded a plane and flew to his luxury dacha in Foros, Crimea. He was going to get a tan. He was going to relax. He'd done it. He'd saved the Union by killing it. The Gang of Eight, back in Moscow, read the treaty in Pravda. They looked at the signing date. They watched Gorbachev's plane disappear toward the Black Sea. The man had just signed his own arrest warrant, and then he'd mailed it to them and left town, awaiting continuing. For the Gang of Eight, the new Union Treaty wasn't a document. It was a 20-page-long confession of treason. It was the complete, itemized receipt of Gorbachev's and Yeltsin's liquidation sale of their entire 70-year-old empire. These men, Kryuchkov at the KGB, Yazov at the Ministry of Defense, were not abstract political theorists. They were managers of a superpower. They understood one thing: control. You either had it, or you didn't. For 7 decades, the center in Moscow had total, unquestioned control. It owned the oil in Siberia, the wheat in Ukraine, the tanks in East Germany, and the souls of every citizen. This new treaty, which Gorbachev had so proudly published and was about to sign on August 20th, was a voluntary, pen-in-hand castration of that control. Let us look at the features of this new union of Soviet sovereign republics that made the hardliners physically ill. First, the name change itself, Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics. They were getting rid of socialist. The entire ideological glue of the state, the very point of the 1917 revolution, was being deleted and replaced with the one word they hated most: sovereign. That word meant Yeltsin won. It meant the war of laws was over, and Russia, Ukraine, and the others were now legally supreme. The central government in Moscow would no longer be the master. It would be an employee, a service provider that the republics hired to run a few errands. Second, the money. The treaty was an economic carbon. It explicitly ceded to the republics ownership of virtually all natural resources, including mineral deposits on their territories. Read that again. The republics, not the central Soviet government, would own the oil. They would own the gas. They would own the gold and the diamonds. For men like Prime Minister Pavlov, this was the end of the world. How do you fund a superpower? How do you pay for a 5 million man army, a global network of spies, and a nuclear arsenal that can end the planet when you have to ask Boris Yeltsin for an allowance? The treaty was turning the mighty Soviet government into a broke, unemployed relative living in the republic's basement, begging for gas money. Third, the chain of command. The treaty was a bureaucratic nightmare that severed the spine of the state. Cause, the treaty gives republics the right to establish direct diplomatic, consular, trade, and other ties with foreign states. Effect, this means the KGB's iron-fisted control over all foreign contact is gone. The republics can now just talk to the West, make their own trade deals, without KGB minders. Consequence, for KGB chief Kryuchkov, this isn't just decentralization. It's a catastrophic security breach. It's inviting the CIA to open a strip mall in every republic's capital. Beat. It also meant the republic's laws trumped the union laws. This wasn't a union. It was an every man for himself anarchy. Beat. The military and the KGB, the two pillars of their world, would be jointly determined by the center and the republics. This meant Yeltsin would have a veto over the Red Army. It was unthinkable. The metacomentary is that the hardliners weren't entirely wrong. From their perspective, Gorbachev was a traitor. He was a man who had been given the keys to the most powerful centralized and feared state in history, and he had, through sheer mind-boggling naivete, allowed a loud-mouthed Siberian populist to talk him into voluntarily handing over the deed, the bank accounts, and the alarm codes. They saw the signing ceremony on August 20th not as a negotiation, but as an execution. Their execution. To them, this wasn't a compromise to save a failing system. It was the failure. It was the legal, constitutional, and final act of dissolving the empire. It was the moment the war of laws would end with Yeltsin's total victory and their total irrelevance. They had a choice. They could sit in their offices and let Gorbachev and Yeltsin sign that paper, effectively firing them all and dismantling their world. Or they could do what Soviet hardliners had always done. They could use force. They chose force. The signing was August 20th. Gorbachev was at his dacha in Crimea, blissfully unaware, working on his tan. The plotters set their plan in motion. They would act before the 20th. They would stop the treaty, arrest the reformers, and restore order. On August 17th, Kryuchkov, the KGB chief, ordered a Group A Alpha Group commando team to fly to Crimea. On August 18th, the plotters themselves, including Gorbachev's own chief of staff, boarded a plane. They were going to pay the president a visit, and they weren't coming to ask for his opinion. So, it's August 18th, 1991, a lovely Sunday afternoon in Crimea. Mikhail Gorbachev, president of the Soviet Union, is living his best life. He's at his dacha, which is called Zarya, or Dawn. This isn't some rustic cabin in the woods. This is a palatial, multi-million ruble compound, a monument of red marble with its own private beach, escalators, a cinema, and tennis courts, all plonked on the edge of the Black Sea. He's just finished the draft of his triumphant speech for the new Union Treaty signing. He's relaxed. He's tan. He is, by all accounts, the most blissfully, catastrophically oblivious man on planet Earth. He is completely unaware that, back in Moscow, his own KGB chief has already set the trap. He doesn't know that his own security detail, the men guarding his dacha, are in on the plot. And he doesn't know that his own chief of staff, Valery Bolden, the man he trusts with his most intimate state secrets, is on a plane hurtling towards him with a set of ultimatums. At 4:30 p.m., a duty officer at the Dacha's communications hub suddenly notices something odd. All the lights on his console just go out, every single one. The special Kafka's government phone line to Moscow, dead. The regular phone lines, dead. The television receivers, black screens. The radios, static. The nuclear briefcase, the cheget that gave him control of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It was just a very expensive, very useless prop. At 4:30 p.m., the president of a nuclear superpower was cut off from the entire world. The trap was sprung. He just didn't know it yet. Moments later, around 4:50 p.m., his chief of security comes to him, visibly nervous, and says, "Mikhail Sergeyevich, there are some people here to see you." Gorbachev is confused. What people? I didn't invite anyone. It's Baklanov, Bolden, Shenin, and Vorenikov. This was the oh crap moment. This wasn't a social call. This was a hit. This was for the hardest hardliners in the entire regime. This was the deputy chief of the Defense Council, his own chief of staff, a Politburo secretary, and the head of the entire Red Army ground forces. They were accompanied by the head of the KGB's guard directorate. They hadn't knocked. They'd just arrived. They stormed into his study. Gorbachev, trying to maintain some scrap of dignity, just looked at them and asked, "So, who sent you?" They didn't sit down. General Vorenikov, a man who probably ate nails for breakfast, did most of the talking. He laid it out. The country was in chaos. The reforms were a disaster. The new Union Treaty, which he was scheduled to sign in 2 days, was treason. It was the final act of dissolving the great Soviet Empire. And they were there to stop it. On behalf of the State Committee on the State of Emergency, a name they had just invented, they had a simple offer. Option 1, Gorbachev signs a decree right now, declaring a nationwide state of emergency. This would cancel the treaty, ban all political parties, i.e. Yeltsin's, and roll back all his reforms. He would then sign over all his power to his vice president, Gennady Yanayev, who was, of course, one of them. Option 2, he could just resign, citing health reasons. Get out of the way and let them, the real men, clean up his mess. This was it. The moment of truth. The man who had tried to talk his way through every crisis, the man who believed in compromise and socialism with a human face, was now staring that human face in the mirror, and it was telling him to surrender or be erased. Gorbachev's reaction. He exploded. This wasn't the weak, indecisive man they were expecting. This was the man who had stared down Reagan. He told them, in no uncertain terms, to go to hell. He called them adventurers and traitors. He called his own chief of staff, Bolden, a scumbag. He told them their plan was a reactionary anti-constitutional coup. He said, "You are trying to arrange a coup d'etat. It is a gamble that will lead to blood in a civil war. Society is not a battalion. You will not succeed." The plotters were stunned. They genuinely, idiotically, believed he would just sign. They thought he was a weakling, a talker, who, when confronted with real power, would fold. He didn't. He told them to get out. The metacomentary here is the ultimate punchline of the Soviet system. These hardliners, the masters of the iron fist, were so used to people obeying out of fear that they had no plan B. Their entire grand, empire-saving coup depended on a single piece of paper, a signature from the very man they were overthrowing, to make it legal. They didn't come to arrest him or shoot him. They came to get his permission to overthrow him. When he said no, they literally didn't know what to do. So they just left. They mumbled, "You'll see," turned around, and flew back to Moscow empty-handed. But the trap remained, cause Gorbachev, on vacation, is completely isolated by his own security forces, who cut all his communications before the plotters even arrive. Effect, a delegation of his own top officials confronts him, demanding he sign a state of emergency or resign. Consequence, Gorbachev flatly refuses, calling them traitors and kicking them out of his office. Beat, the baffled plotters, who had no plan for his refusal, fly back to Moscow to start their coup anyway. Now in the worst possible position, trying to run a legal takeover, without the one signature they needed. Beat, Gorbachev, along with his family, is left behind in Foros. He is no longer a president. He is a prisoner under house arrest guarded by the KGB, totally cut off from the world, watching his own resignation on a tiny smuggled-in radio, completely powerless to stop the tanks that are at that very moment rolling into Moscow. It's 6 a.m., Monday, August 19, 1991. Moscow wakes up. Weird. There's no news. There's no peppy morning show. Every television channel in the entire 11 time zone empire is playing the same thing, on a loop. Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. Now, in the West, that means classy. In the Soviet Union, it meant one of two things: a high-ranking state official had just died, or a coup was in progress. Given that all of them were playing it, the smart money was on the coup. Then, the ballet abruptly cuts to a stone-faced, funereal news anchor. He reads a statement from a group nobody has ever heard of, the State Committee on the State of Emergency, or GKCHP. The announcement is a masterwork of Orwellian dread. Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, it begins, is unable to perform his presidential duty for health reasons. He's not sick. He's not on vacation. He's just unable. The statement declares that Vice President Gennady Yaneyev, one of the Gang of Eight, is now the acting president. And the GKCHP, this shadowy cabal of the KGB chief, the defense minister, and the interior minister, is now in total control. They are here, they claim, to save the motherland from the mortal danger of Gorbachev's reforms, to stop the extremist forces, that's Yeltsin, and to prevent the total disintegration of the country, that's the new Union Treaty. Then came Resolution No. 1. It was a hardliner's wish list. All political parties, banned all strikes and demonstrations, banned all newspapers except for 9 ancient, hardline communist rags, banned. Glasnost was over. Perestroika was over. The clocks were being turned back to 1982. It was a full, iron-fisted, Stalinist reboot. And as Muscovites were processing this, they heard a new sound, a low, clanking, earth-shaking rumble. The tanks were here. Defense Minister Yazov had ordered the elite Taman Guards and Kandemir tank divisions into the capital, columns of T-72 and T-80 tanks, APCs, and thousands of troops rumbled over the bridges and took up positions. They surrounded the Kremlin. They blocked Red Square. They parked, with menacing, profound silence, in the middle of major intersections. The message was clear. This was not a political debate. This was a military occupation of their own capital. The Gang of Eight had made the classic authoritarian blunder. They assumed that the sight of tanks would send everyone scurrying back to their apartments, cowed and obedient, just like they had in Prague in '68 or Hungary in '56. But this was 1991, and this was Moscow, and they had made one fatal, cataclysmic miscalculation. They forgot to arrest Yeltsin. In their infinite bureaucratic stupidity, the plotters had sent a KGB unit to Yeltsin's dacha, but they had no clear orders. Arrest him, detain him, ask him to join. They just waited. And Yeltsin, the second he heard the news, didn't wait. He, his family, and his top aides piled into their motorcade and just drove. They blew right past the confused KGB blockade and made a mad dash for the center of Moscow. His destination, the White House, the nickname for the massive, marble-faced parliament building of the Russian Republic, his fortress. By 10 a.m., Yeltsin was inside, working the phones, surrounded by his loyalists. The plotters had just allowed the single most charismatic, popular, and democratically elected man in the entire country to reach a microphone inside a heavily fortified building, which was, at that very moment, being surrounded by their own tanks. This is the meta commentary. The coup was an analog solution in a digital world. The plotters thought controlling the TV and the army was enough. They forgot that Yeltsin had something they didn't: legitimacy. He didn't need to control the state. He was the state, or at least the one the people had actually voted for. At 12:50 p.m., Boris Yeltsin did the thing that would define the entire crisis. He walked out the front door. He walked right past the stunned soldiers. He saw a tank from the Taman division, number 110, parked in his driveway. And he climbed on top of it. He was big, he was silver-haired, and he was furious. He stood on the turret, a rumpled president on a 40-ton war machine, and he didn't whisper. He bellowed. Cause the GKCHP rolls tanks into Moscow to seize control, but fails to arrest their primary target, Boris Yeltsin. Effect: Yeltsin races to the Russian White House, the symbol of his government, which is now surrounded by the plotters' army. Consequence: instead of hiding, Yeltsin walks outside and climbs onto one of the very tanks sent to intimidate him. Beat: he delivers an impromptu, world-changing speech, not to the world, but to the soldiers on the other tanks. Beat: he calls the Gang of 8 criminals and traitors. He declares their state committee an anti-constitutional, reactionary coup. He appeals directly to the soldiers and their officers to disobey the illegal orders of the junta and to remember their loyalty, not to the dying USSR, but to the Russian people and their elected president. This was the moment. It was the ultimate "who are you gonna believe?" He was the elected president, standing on a tank, daring them to shoot him. The plotters were a bunch of shadowy old men hiding in the Kremlin, claiming the real president was sick. The image was electric. It was smuggled out by the few remaining independent journalists and flashed on every TV screen in the world. The hardliners had tried to project strength with their tanks, and in one move, Yeltsin had hijacked their biggest symbol and turned it into a stage for his own defiance. Day one wasn't even over, and the plotters were already losing. So, Boris Yeltsin has just wrapped up his soliloquy on top of a tank. The image is already blasting around the world. The narrative is no longer the army has taken over. It's the army is facing off against the elected president of Russia. The Gang of 8, holed up in the Kremlin, are in a full-blown panic. Their entire plan was based on a simple 1950-style equation: tanks plus TV announcement equals obedience. They were not prepared for a charismatic, democratically elected rival with a flair for the dramatic. They had a massive PR problem. They had to prove to the world and to their own people that they were the new bosses. They had to look strong, stable, and in charge. They had to sell the coup. So, at 5 p.m. on day one, they scheduled a press conference. This, right here, is the meta commentary on the entire collapse. The coup was old-school Soviet, but the response had to be new-school Glasnost. Gorbachev had, in a terrible irony for the plotters, created a world where even dictators had to face the media, and these guys were not ready for prime time. The press conference was a masterclass in failure. It was held in the Foreign Ministry's press center, packed with hundreds of local and international journalists who were practically vibrating with adrenaline. They weren't the crowd, note-taking scribe of the Brezhnev era. These were the new, aggressive reporters of Glasnost. And they smelled blood. The Gang of 8 didn't even show up. The two main brains of the Operation KGB chief Kryuchkov and Defense Minister Yazov were nowhere to be seen. They were, presumably, busy trying to figure out why Yeltsin wasn't in handcuffs. Instead, they sent the B team. The front man was the new acting president, Gennady Yanayev. He was flanked by Boris Pugo, interior minister, and a few other fossils from the industrial and agricultural committees. Yanayev, a career-long, gray suit-wearing, mid-level party hack, was the man they chose to be the iron-fisted new face of the empire. He sat down at the long table, looked out at the flashing cameras, and promptly, visibly, began to fall apart. He was pale. He was sweating. He was visibly, profoundly terrified. He read a prepared statement, his voice cracking, insisting this was not a coup. It was just a temporary, constitutional, totally normal state of emergency to save the country from chaos. Then came the questions, and they were brutal. Where is President Gorbachev? What is the specific nature of his illness? Can we speak to his doctors? And the kill shot from a young Russian reporter named Tatyana Malkina. Could you please say whether or not you understand that last night you carried out a coup d'etat? The room went silent. Yanayev just stared. He fumbled. He insisted. No. But the real answer wasn't in his words. It was in his hands. As he was trying to sell the biggest lie of his life, Gennady Yanayev's hands were shaking uncontrollably. We're not talking a minor tremor. We're talking a full-on, high-frequency vibration. Like he was trying to hold a jackhammer steady. Speculation was rampant. Was he drunk? Was he having a nervous breakdown? Was he just, as he later claimed, stone-cold sober and that terrified? It didn't matter. The cameras zoomed in. The whole world was watching the new Stalin try to take a sip of water and rattling the glass against his teeth. Let's do this logic chain, because it's beautiful. Cause the GKCHP, having failed to arrest Yeltsin, desperately needs to project an image of absolute strength and control. Effect, they call a live, televised press conference to introduce themselves as the new, legitimate government. Consequence, the chosen spokesman, acting President Yanayev, is visibly terrified, sweats profusely, and his hands shake uncontrollably on camera. Beat, when asked about Gorbachev, Yanayev spouts a transparently absurd lie, claiming his friend Mikhail Sergeyevich is very tired and resting in Crimea. Beat, the press conference, meant to intimidate the world, instead broadcasts a message of pure, pathetic weakness, incompetence, and fear. This was the moment the coup died. It was death by bad optics. Yeltsin, watching this disaster from the White House, is said to have just laughed. He wasn't up against a cabal of ruthless, brilliant Machiavellian plotters. He was up against these guys. A committee of shaky-handed, sweating, lying bureaucrats who couldn't even manage a simple press conference. The image of Yanayev's trembling hands became the symbol of the entire coup. It wasn't an iron fist. It was a palsied claw. It told every citizen, every soldier, and every general everything they needed to know. The bad guys were in charge, and they were scared. The resistance, which had been a few thousand people just hours before, was about to become a tidal wave. Let's do a quick compare and contrast, shall we? In one corner, we have the new leadership of the Soviet Union, the GKCHP. Their big day one PR move was a press conference so disastrous, so drenched in flop, sweat, and terror, that their leader's shaking hands became the lead story. They projected weakness, incompetence, and the frantic, pathetic energy of a man trying to lie to a cop while actively on fire. In the other corner, we have Boris Yeltsin. The image of Yeltsin, standing rumpled and furious on the turret of tank number 110, was the antidote to Yanayev's trembling. It was the shot of pure, uncut adrenaline the country needed. It wasn't just a speech. It was a symbol. It was the single moment that transformed the entire event. It was no longer a coup, an internal power struggle between gray men. It was now a siege. The illegitimate state versus the legitimate, elected people, and the people responded. The meta commentary here is just delicious. The Gang of Eight, in their infinite wisdom, had rolled hundreds of tanks into Moscow. They did this to project power. They did this to intimidate, but they had, in one colossal, unforced error, provided their single greatest enemy with the most powerful prop in human history. Yeltsin didn't just give a speech. He gave a speech from their own tank. He hijacked their primary symbol of terror and turned it into a podium of defiance. He looked at their iron fist and, with the whole world watching, he high-fived it, took its wallet, and gave it a noogie. This moment, broadcast by the few brave cameramen who defied the media ban, was the spark. It was the bat signal for every Muscovite who had spent the last 5 years of Glasnost learning to stop being afraid. All afternoon, the crowd outside the Russian White House had been a few hundred, then a few thousand, confused, scared, and angry people. Cause, Yeltsin's speech gives the formless, anxious crowd a leader, a location, the White House, and a moral justification defending the Constitution against traitors. Effect, the crowd, which was just a protest, transforms into a defense force. Consequence, tens of thousands of people begin to flood the bridges and streets toward the White House, not away from it. Beat, they start building barricades. Instantly. Beat, this wasn't some organized, pre-planned thing. This was a spontaneous, chaotic, beautiful mess of what do we have engineering. People dragged over park benches. They tore up paving stones and scaffolding from nearby construction sites. They pushed trolley buses out of their lines, slashed the tires, and turned them sideways to block the bridges. They linked arms. They made a human chain. They brought guitars and sausages. Grandmothers showed up with sandwiches for the tank crews who were supposed to be invading them. This was the critical, unspoken part of Yeltsin's speech. He wasn't just talking to the crowd. He was talking to the soldiers sitting in the tanks, and they did nothing. The crew of tank number 110 just sat there. They listened to him. They didn't shoot. They didn't arrest him. They didn't even tell him to get down. Their commander, Major Yevdokimov of the Taman Division, had reportedly already been questioning his orders. When the elected president of Russia climbed on his tank, he had to make a choice. And his choice to not act was everything. This was the fraternization the plotters were terrified of. The tanks, the symbols of their power, were being neutralized by old women with food and young kids with flowers. The soldiers, who had been told they were rolling in to save the country from chaos, were now looking at unarmed civilians, singing and waving the new Russian tricolor flag. And a very confused 19-year-old in a tank hatch was having to decide if he was going to run over his own people to save a bunch of trembling old Stalinists by nightfall on day one. Yeltsin's tank speech had created a new reality. The Russian White House was no longer just a parliament building. It was a fortress. It was free Russia, a tiny island of democratic defiance surrounded by a sea of Soviet tanks. And that sea was looking increasingly lukewarm and confused, while Yeltsin was turning a tank into a viral media moment. And the Gang of Eight was self-destructing at their own press conference. The rest of the world's leaders were having a full-blown who do I call panic attack. The switchboards in Washington, London, and Paris lit up. And the main question on everyone's mind was, who the hell is in charge of the nukes? This was the ultimate geopolitical nightmare. The Cold War, which everyone had just celebrated being over, was suddenly back, and it was on meth. The global response was not a heroic, unified cry for democracy. It was a terrified, stammering, 24-hour-long ooh. Leading this masterclass in strategic hesitation was U.S. President George H.W. Bush. Bush, you have to remember, hated this kind of chaos. He was a creature of stability. His entire foreign policy was built on his personal, stable, predictable relationship with Gorbachev. He liked Gorbachev. He had deals with Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the reliable partner who had helped him end the Cold War and reunify Germany. Boris Yeltsin. Bush saw Yeltsin the same way a corporate CEO sees a renegade, populist, hard-drinking regional manager who's always yelling at shareholder meetings. He saw him as a demagogue, a hothead, a guy who was just as likely to start a civil war as he was to lead a democracy. So when the coup happened, the White House was paralyzed. Cause the GKCHB, a group of extra-constitutional hardliners, seizes power from Gorbachev, the West's main partner. Effect, the Bush administration is caught in a high-stakes guessing game, trapped between three terrible, competing options. Option 1, the official one, condemn the coup and demand the return of the legitimate leader, Gorbachev. This was the safe, moral high ground. But it was also a fantasy. Gorbachev was incommunicado, a prisoner in his own dacha. Option 2, the realist one, secretly accept the coup as a fait accompli. Some in the administration were reportedly flirting with this. Maybe these new guys, these shaky-handed thugs, were the only ones who could control the country and, most importantly, its 27,000 nuclear weapons. Better a stable dictatorship than a chaotic civil war. Option 3, the risky one, back the other guy, Boris Yeltsin. This was the democratic choice, but it was a massive gamble. What if Yeltsin lost? What if he was just a populist blowhard? Backing him was an act of war against the new government in the Kremlin. The metacomentary here is the sheer terror that democratic ideals inspire in established power. For 24 hours, the world flirted with just letting the Stalinists win, because at least they were a known quantity. So, Bush did what all good diplomats do. He tried to do all three. Publicly, he condemned the coup. He called it extra-constitutional. He froze economic aid. He made a stern face for the cameras. But who did he call? For the first critical 24 hours, his calls to Moscow were a mess. He couldn't get Gorbachev, and he didn't call Yeltsin. To the people standing on the barricades at the White House, this silence from the leader of the free world was deafening. It felt like a betrayal. Finally, on day 2, after Yeltsin had climbed the tank, after the coup looked pathetic, after it was clear the army was wavering, Bush's team finally got Yeltsin on the phone. And the call was a perfect example of his covering a bit strategy. It wasn't a heroic "we stand with you, Boris" message. It was a cold, political calculation. Bush told Yeltsin that the US would only resume normal relations and unfreeze aid after Gorbachev was returned to his post. Think about that. Yeltsin is literally risking his life, standing on a tank, facing down the entire KGB, and the US president calls him up and says, "Hey, great job. Now, can you get my guy his job back?" It was a signal that the West, at that moment, was still backing a ghost. They were betting on the past Gorbachev and the present the coup plotter stability. But they were terrified to put all their chips on the future Yeltsin. It didn't matter. Yeltsin didn't need Bush's permission. He just needed him to stay out of the way. The battle for the Soviet Union wasn't going to be won on the phone lines to Washington. It was going to be won in the streets of Moscow, and more importantly, in the minds of the soldiers sent to shut him up. So, day 1 ends with a tale of two leaders. Yanayev, the acting pretend president, has just face-planted on live television, becoming an instant meme for incompetent tyranny. Yeltsin, the actual elected president of Russia, has just delivered the performance of his life from the turret of a tank, becoming an instant symbol of badass democratic defiance. Now it's the night of August 19th, bleeding into the miserable, rainy morning of August 20th. Day 2, and the energy in Moscow has shifted. The fear is still there, absolutely. Everyone knows the GKCHP has the guns. Everyone knows the KGB headquarters, the Lubyanka, is just down the road, probably sharpening its interrogation tools. Rumors are flying thick and fast. Yeltsin's been arrested. The White House is about to be stormed. The army is bringing in flamethrowers. Okay, maybe not flamethrowers, but you get the idea. But something else is brewing, something the Gang of Eight, with their dusty copies of Lenin and their maps full of tank columns, could never have predicted. People power. Annoyed, drenched, slightly tipsy, but fundamentally uncowed people power. Yeltsin's speech hadn't just been a good soundbite, it had been a call to action. He'd basically said, "Get your asses down here and help." And they came, tens of thousands of them. This wasn't an organized protest. This was a spontaneous human migration towards the epicenter of the crisis. Students skipped classes. Office workers ditched their desks. Babushkas brought thermoses of tea and questionable pierogi. There were poets, rock musicians, veterans in old uniforms, even off-duty cops who didn't like the look of this whole coup thing. They converged on the Russian White House, this giant marble showbox on the Moscow River, because Yeltsin had made it the Alamo. It was the last free place in the country, and they were going to defend it. How do you defend a building against tanks when all you have are umbrellas and bad attitudes? You build barricades. Glorious, insane, utterly ridiculous barricades. The metacomentary here is the beautiful absurdity of citizen engineering under pressure. This was like the world's most high-stakes, post-apocalyptic neighborhood cleanup. Cause, Yeltsin's call for resistance inspires tens of thousands of ordinary Muscovites to converge on the White House. Effect, lacking weapons, they spontaneously begin constructing massive, makeshift barricades to physically block the expected military assault. Consequence, they use whatever they can find. Park benches ripped from the ground, scaffolding from nearby construction sites, city buses and trolleybuses dragged across intersections, with their tires slashed, beat. They even pull up chunks of pavement and dumpsters, creating a multi-layered, Mad Max-style perimeter around the entire building complex. Beat. This wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a moral one. To attack the White House now, the army wouldn't just be shooting at a building, they'd have to bulldoze through their own neighbors' garbage cans and park benches, while being yelled at by those same neighbors. The atmosphere around the White House was surreal. It was part siege, part rock festival. It was pouring rain. People huddled under plastic sheets. Bonfires were lit in old oil drums. Someone was playing Victor Soy songs on a guitar. People shared cigarettes, vodka, and soggy sandwiches, and crucially, they talked to the soldiers. The tank crews who hadn't defected were still parked there. Grim-faced teenagers mostly, looking utterly miserable and confused. People weren't screaming at them, they were reasoning with them. Why are you here? You're Russian. We're Russian. Don't shoot your own people. Have a sausage inside the White House. It was organized chaos. Yeltsin and his team were running a government in exile from inside their own capital. They were issuing decrees, printed on smuggled photocopiers and passed hand-to-hand through the crowd. They were desperately working the phones, trying to find which army generals, which KGB colonels might still be loyal. Yeltsin himself was a whirlwind, giving interviews to the few Western reporters who snuck in, holding emergency sessions of the Russian parliament, and famously, taking naps on a couch in his office between bouts of saving democracy. The plan to storm the White House, codenamed Operation Grom Thunder, was real. The KGB's elite Alpha Group and Wimpel units, backed by paratroopers and tanks, were supposed to assault the building. At 3 a.m. on August 21st, the plan called for overwhelming force, expecting thousands of casualties. But the barricades, and the sheer number of people defending them, estimated at over 50,000 by day 2, changed the calculus. This wasn't going to be a clean surgical strike. This was going to be a massacre. Live on CNN. And the soldiers knew it. The men ordered to carry out Operation Grom were looking at the singing crowds, the grandmothers with tea, the ridiculous barricades made of park benches, and their resolve started to crumble. So, the stage is set for an apocalypse. It's the night of August 20th. Going into the early hours of August 21st, the Russian White House is a fortress of human flesh and scrap metal, surrounded by maybe 50,000 increasingly cold, wet, but stubbornly defiant Muscovites. Inside, Yeltsin is running on fumes and fury. Outside, the Soviet military, supposedly loyal to the GKCHP, is parked in menacing formations, engines idling. Back in the Kremlin, or maybe the Ministry of Defense bunker, who knows where these geniuses were hiding. The Gang of Eight is facing reality. Their shaky-handed press conference was a global joke. Yeltsin is still free, still broadcasting defiance. The crowd isn't dispersing, it's growing. Their authority is evaporating faster than vodka. At a frat party, they had one card left to play, the final card, the one they probably should have played on day one if they weren't such incompetent Bond villains. Force. Overwhelming, brutal, nightmarish force. The plan was codenamed Grom, Thunder. And it was exactly that. The KGB's Directorate V Wimpel and Group A Alpha, these are not your local traffic cops. These are the Spetsnaz. The guys who stormed palaces in Afghanistan and hunted dissidents in Siberia were tasked with leading the assault. They'd be backed by paratroopers from the Tula Division, Oman Black Berets, and Dzerzhinsky Division interior troops. We're talking thousands of highly trained, heavily armed professionals. The objective: storm the White House, neutralize the defenders, wrest Yeltsin and his government, end the resistance, cut the head off the snake. The assault was scheduled for 3 a.m., August 21st. Everyone knew it was coming. The tension around the White House was thick enough to chew. Yeltsin's makeshift defense team distributed the few weapons they had, mostly pistols and hunting rifles. Priests walked through the crowd, offering blessings. People wrote their names and addresses on slips of paper and put them in their pockets so their bodies could be identified. They were expecting a massacre, and the commanders of Alpha Group knew it too. These were stone-cold professionals. They did the math. They looked at the pathetic barricades, but they also looked at the 50,000 unarmed people behind them. They listened to the reports from their own men mingling in the crowd. They saw the TV cameras perched on nearby rooftops, ready to broadcast every gunshot to the entire planet. This wasn't Kabul. This wasn't some distant rebellion. This was the center of Moscow. These were their own people, and the orders they were receiving were coming from a committee whose leader couldn't even hold a glass of water steady. The moment of truth arrived. The final go order was apparently given, and the commanders of Alpha Group, led by Major General Viktor Karpukin, did the single most revolutionary, system-shattering thing possible in the Soviet Union. They said, "Nyet, let's trace this critical failure cascade. Cause: the GKCHP, desperate to regain control, orders its most elite KGB units, Alpha and Wimpel, and supporting army interior troops to launch Operation Grom, a full-scale assault on the heavily defended Russian White House. Effect: the commanders on the ground, particularly within Alpha Group, assess the situation. Tens of thousands of civilians forming human shields. Inadequate planning for such massive resistance. Guaranteed international condemnation for a bloodbath. And dubious legality, political backing from the shaky GKCHP. Consequence: the commanders collectively refused the direct order to storm the building, citing the unacceptable certainty of mass civilian casualties and the questionable legitimacy of the command. Beat: this wasn't passive foot-dragging. This was a direct refusal, communicated up the chain, effectively paralyzing the entire military component of the coup. Beat: the refusal by the KGB's own elite killers sends a shockwave through the system. If they won't do it, who will? Defense Minister Yazov and KGB Chief Kryuchkov realize their ultimate weapon has jammed. The medicamentary is just exquisite. The Soviet system was built on the unquestioning obedience of its enforcement arms. The KGB, in particular, was the sword and shield, the final guarantor of party rule. And here, at the absolute climax of the crisis, the sword refused to strike. Why? Not necessarily because they suddenly became Jeffersonian Democrats. More likely, it was a cold professional calculation. This order was insane. The political situation was unstable. Executing this massacre would make them the scapegoats. And there was a non-zero chance. The guy inside the White House was going to be their boss tomorrow. It was the ultimate act of bureaucratic self-preservation masquerading as conscience. The system was so broken, even its assassins were hedging their bets. News, or rather the lack of news, spread like wildfire. 3 a.m. came and went. No explosions, no gunfire, no screaming. Just the rain, the flickering bonfires, and the murmur of 50,000 exhausted, terrified, but still standing people. The refusal wasn't universal. Some paratrooper units reportedly tried to advance. Some Oman units skirmished with protesters near the barricades, leading to the tragic deaths of 3 young men who tried to block APCs in a nearby tunnel. The only fatalities of the Moscow standoff. But the main assault, the coordinated, overwhelming storming of the White House itself, it never happened. The army, the final pillar of the Soviet state, had refused to fire on its own people. The coup hadn't been defeated by force of arms. It had been defeated by a combination of Yeltsin's charisma, 50,000 soggy protesters, And the sudden, inconvenient discovery of a conscience or a survival instinct within the KGB's own elite units. The Gang of Eight had played their last card, and it was a dud. The game was over. Dawn breaks on Wednesday, August 21st, day 3, and it's the dawn of the dead. Coup. The 3 a.m. deadline for Operation Grom came and went. The sound wasn't thunder. It was the deafening silence of insubordination. The elite KGB commandos, the very sharpened tip of the Soviet spear, had looked at the prospect of machine gunning 50,000 singing civilians in the rain and decided, collectively, nah, we're good, back in whatever bunker the Gang of Eight was currently infesting. This news landed like a tactical nuke made of pure failure. Their ultimate weapon, the fear of the KGB and the might of the Red Army, had just been publicly shown to be optional. The meta commentary here is almost too easy. This wasn't a political defeat. This was a systemic core meltdown. The entire Soviet edifice, for 70 years, ran on the assumption that orders would be obeyed, especially kill orders. The moment the killers themselves started saying maybe not, the whole operating system crashed. Blue screen of death, Soviet edition, panic, pure, unadulterated. Where's my escape helicopter? Panic erupted among the plotters. These were men who had planned the takeover with all the strategic foresight of a toddler trying to steal cookies. They had no plan B. Plan A was tanks go BRRR. People get scared. We win. Plan A had failed spectacularly. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, the guy who'd ordered the tanks in just 48 hours earlier, was the first to crack. He saw the writing on the wall, and it said treason trial. Sometime around dawn on the 21st, realizing his own army wouldn't commit mass murder for this clown show, he gave the order, pull the troops out, all of them, get them out of Moscow now. Muscovites woke up to the bizarre, beautiful sight of tanks, which had been menacing symbols of oppression the day before, now sheepishly turning around and trundling back to their barracks, often with the new Russian tricolor flag fluttering from their antennas. Some soldiers were smiling, waving. The occupation was over. The coup plotters had effectively just rage quit. What followed was less a coordinated retreat and more a frantic scramble for the exits, like the lights coming on at a terrible party. Let us follow the logic of this implosion. Cause the elite military, KGB units refused the order to storm the White House, signaling the complete collapse of the GKCHP's authority over the armed forces. Effect, Defense Minister Yazov, seeing the military mutiny and the growing crowds, orders a full withdrawal of all troops from Moscow. Consequence, this public withdrawal confirms the coup has failed, triggering mass panic and Sov keep every man for himself among the plotters. Beat, some of the plotters including Yazov, Kryuchkov and others make a desperate, last-ditch flight to Crimea, hoping to negotiate with Gorbachev, the man they had just overthrown and imprisoned. Yes, really, they were going to apologize and ask for their jobs back. The sheer brass balls, or perhaps sheer stupidity, is breathtaking. Beat, others just dissolved. Prime Minister Pavlov reportedly checked into a hospital, claiming sudden illness, possibly alcohol-induced. Vice President Yanayev, the man with the famously trembling hands, allegedly locked himself in his office and started drinking heavily, preparing for the inevitable knock on the door. This wasn't a strategic withdrawal. This was the Keystone Cops trying to stage a coup. They had seized power, announced it to the world, rolled out the tanks, and then, less than 72 hours later, they were literally running away, drunk, or trying to apologize to their hostage. Meanwhile, at the White House, the news of the troop withdrawal and the plotters' flight sparked pandemonium, not fear, but pure, unadulterated joy. People were cheering, weeping, hugging strangers. The siege was over. They had won. They had faced down the tanks, the KGB, the entire dead weight of Soviet history, and they had won. Yeltsin, never one to miss a victory lap, emerged onto the balcony to address the ecstatic crowd. He wasn't just the president of Russia anymore. He was the hero, the giant slayer, the man who stood on the tank and broke the coup. By the afternoon of August 21st, the GKCHP officially ceased to exist. Warrants were being drawn up. The plotters who hadn't managed to flee were being rounded up. The 3-day experiment in turning back the clock had ended not with a bang, but with a pathetic, whimpering fizzle. The Soviet Union's last gasp had been less of a roar and more of a drunken hiccup. And the man they had tried to erase, Mikhail Gorbachev, was still sitting in his Crimean dacha, completely unaware that the coup against him had already collapsed and that his rescuers and his political executioners were on their way. So, while Moscow is erupting in a giant, tearful, vodka-fueled street party celebrating the death of the coup and the apparent birth of a new Russia, Let's cut back to Crimea. Remember Gorbachev, our tanned, relaxed, politically comatose president, chilling under house arrest in his luxury prison by the sea. Well, his phone lines suddenly start working again, round midday on August 21st. After nearly 3 days of total isolation punctuated only by smuggled in radio reports, and the sheer terror of not knowing if his own guards were going to execute him, communication is restored, but it's not his people calling, it's Yeltsin's people. A plane full of Russian officials, led by Yeltsin's vice president Alexander Rudskoy, is en route to rescue him. Think about that phrasing. The president of the Soviet Union is being rescued by the government of Russia. He's not being airlifted out by his own loyal forces. He's being picked up like a stranded tourist by the rival tour company. And just before the rescuers arrive, guess who else shows up, hats in hand, looking for a chat? The plotters, yes, Kryuchkov, Yazov, and the gang, fresh from their epic fail in Moscow, actually flew down to Crimea, apparently hoping Gorbachev would, forgive them. Give them pointers on how to stage a better coup next time? Gorbachev, finally back in contact with reality, or at least a reality, refused to even see them. He knew the coup had collapsed. He knew Yeltsin was sending a plane. These weren't negotiators. They were criminals fleeing the scene. He ordered his remaining loyal guards, the few who hadn't, join the coup, to basically hold them at bay until Yeltsin's cavalry arrived. When Rudskoy and the Russian delegation landed, their first act wasn't just to greet Gorbachev. It was to arrest the coup plotters right there on the tarmac. The symbolism was brutal. The president of the USSR was irrelevant. The Russian VP was making arrests on his behalf. Then came the flight back to Moscow, late on the night of August 21st, stretching into the early hours of the 22nd. This wasn't a triumphant return. It was awkward. Gorbachev and his visibly shaken wife, Raisa, were flying back on a plane controlled by Yeltsin's men, surrounded by the officials who had just saved the country from his own government when they landed at Moscow's Vnukovo airport. The optics were just devastating. Gorbachev walked down the steps, looking physically fine. He was tanned. He looked rested, almost annoyingly so, like a man who'd missed all the drama because he was napping by the pool. But politically, he was a ghost, a relic. The country he had left just a few days earlier no longer existed. The power dynamics had been irrevocably scrambled. He just didn't realize it yet. This is the peak metacomentary moment. Gorbachev steps off the plane thinking he's returning as the conquering hero, the legitimate president restored to his throne. He is about to find out he has the historical equivalent of the guy who gets back from a week-long camping trip to discover his house has been sold, his wife has left him, and the locks have been changed. His first press conference, held shortly after his return, was a political suicide note written in invisible ink that only he couldn't see. He looked tired now, yes, but also defiant. He praised the people who resisted. He condemned the plotters, standard stuff. But then, he started talking about the Communist Party. He was still talking about reforming it. He believed the party itself wasn't to blame, just some reactionary forces within it. He spoke about purging the bad apples and continuing on the path of renewed socialism. He still believed he could salvage the new Union Treaty. He was acting like he could just rewind the tape to August 18th and hit play again. The journalists, the politicians, everyone watching this performance collectively facepalmed. Didn't he get it? Let us trace the disastrous cause and effect of his cluelessness. Cause Gorbachev returns from isolation, completely failing to grasp the revolutionary shift in power that occurred during the 3 days of the coup. Effect, in his first public statements, he defends the Communist Party and talks about continuing his pre-coup agenda, acting as if he is still the primary political force. Consequence, this demonstrates a catastrophic disconnect from reality, making him look weak, out of touch, and utterly irrelevant. Beat Boris Yeltsin, who did understand the new reality because he created it, immediately seized the narrative, positioning himself not just as the defender of democracy, but as the liquidator of the old regime. Beat Gorbachev's attempt to save the Communist Party, the very institution whose hardliners had just tried to overthrow him, alienated his remaining democratic supporters, and played directly into Yeltsin's hands. The crowd that had cheered Yeltsin wasn't chanting "Long live Gorbachev." They were chanting "Down with the Communist Party." They saw the party, correctly, as the source of the rot, the enabler of the coup. And here was Gorbachev, the supposed reformer, still trying to give CPR to the monster that had just tried to eat him. He just didn't understand. He thought he was coming back to his Moscow. He wasn't. He was coming back to Yeltsin's Moscow. He thought he could pick up where he left off. He couldn't. The coup hadn't just failed. It had acted as a 3-day-long chemical peel, burning away the last vestiges of Soviet authority and revealing the raw, angry face of a new Russia underneath, and that face belonged to Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev was just the tanned, bewildered guy photobombing the revolution. So, Gorbachev is back, tanned, bewildered, and delivering press conferences that sound like they were beamed in from 1988. He is babbling about reforming the Communist Party, the very entity whose senior leadership just tried to have him whacked and replace him with a guy whose hands shake like a malfunctioning paint mixer. It is like watching a man whose house just burned down meticulously trying to save his singed collection of Beanie Babies. But Boris Yeltsin, Boris is not confused. Boris understands exactly what just happened. The coup wasn't a failure. It was a gift. It wasn't a crisis. It was an opportunity. It was the final, rusty nail needed to seal the coffin of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. And he was holding the biggest damn hammer. The scene shifts to August 23rd. Just 2 days after the coup collapsed, Gorbachev, still trying to project authority he no longer possesses, goes to address the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic. Get the irony? The president of the entire USSR is showing up as a guest speaker at the parliament of one of his republics, the one run by his mortal enemy. It is like the CEO having to show up at the regional sales meeting to explain why the company didn't totally implode on his watch. Gorbachev walks in, expecting what? Respect, deference, maybe a slow clap for surviving. He gets Yeltsin, and Yeltsin is in full predator mode. This isn't a debate. This isn't a negotiation. This is a public execution. Yeltsin treats Gorbachev not as his boss, but as a slightly embarrassing employee who needs to be publicly reprimanded before being fired. Yeltsin essentially summons Gorbachev to the podium. He doesn't invite him. He directs him, and then the humiliation begins. Yeltsin starts reading, aloud, transcripts of Gorbachev's own cabinet ministers discussing the coup before it happened. He's got the receipts. He's showing everyone live on television that Gorbachev's own hand-picked team, the men he still seemed reluctant to fully condemn, were plotting against him. Gorbachev stands there, looking smaller and smaller. He tries to interrupt. He tries to explain. Yeltsin just waves him off, literally silencing the president of the Soviet Union like an annoying heckler. And then comes the kill shot. While Gorbachev is still standing there, squirming under the lights, Yeltsin pulls out a piece of paper. It's a decree. He announces, with a flourish that would make a Roman emperor blush, that he, Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, is hereby suspending the activities of the Communist Party of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, effective immediately. He signs it. Right there, on the podium. Probably use Gorbachev's back as a desk if he could have. Boom. Let's trace the sheer brutality of this power play. Cause Yeltsin, empowered by his popular resistance to the coup, and Gorbachev's visible weakness, wants to eliminate the Communist Party as a rival power center once and for all. Effect, he engineers a public confrontation with Gorbachev at the Russian parliament, using evidence of cabinet complicity to corner him. Consequence, while Gorbachev is still reeling, Yeltsin unilaterally signs a decree as president of Russia, banning the Russian branch of the Communist Party on Russian territory. Beat! This isn't just a political move, it's a decapitation. The Communist Party was the state. Banning it in Russia, the largest republic, is like banning the brain in the body. Beat! Gorbachev, the general secretary of the All-Union Communist Party at title he would resign the very next day, is forced to stand by, mute and powerless, while his rival dismantles his power base right in front of him. It's the ultimate checkmate. The meta commentary is almost painful to watch. Gorbachev, the man who tried to reform the system from within, the guy who believed in socialism with a human face, is publicly neutered by the populist brawler who understood that the system couldn't be reformed. It had to be broken. Yeltsin wasn't just banning a political party, he was exercising a 74-year-old demon. Live on national television and using the high priest himself as a prop. Gorbachev was stunned. He mumbled something about needing to consult lawyers about how this should be done constitutionally. Yeltsin basically patted him on the head and sent him back to his seat. The message was unmistakable. The Communist Party, the monolithic entity that had ruled the empire with an iron fist for 3 generations, the organization for which millions had died and millions more had suffered, was just cancelled by one man with one signature in its largest republic. And the president of the Soviet Union, the general secretary of that very party, couldn't do a damn thing about it. He was a king who had just been informed, mid-coronation, that his kingdom had been dissolved and his castle was being turned into condos. This wasn't just kicking a man when he was down. This was drop-kicking him, then stealing his wallet, then setting his political house on fire, all while forcing him to watch and smile for the cameras. The Soviet Union wasn't officially dead yet, but Yeltsin had just pulled its plug, ripped out its heart, and stomped on it for good measure. Gorbachev was now just waiting for the flat line. So, Yeltsin has just drop-kicked the Communist Party into the dustbin of history. Using Gorbachev's face as the backbod, the scene is pure, unadulterated chaos. The supposed government of the Soviet Union, the one headed by Gorbachev, is technically still there, but it is like the cartoon character who ran off the cliff and hasn't looked down yet. There's no ground beneath its feet. The coup, that magnificent 3-day festival of incompetence staged by the Gang of Eight, hadn't just failed to save the Soviet Union, it had actively, aggressively, and hilariously murdered it. The hardliners thought they were giving the empire a shot of adrenaline. Instead, they administered a lethal dose of cyanide, followed by a chaser of pure farce. Because what did the coup really prove? It proved the center was weak. It proved the KGB could be defied. It proved the mighty Red Army would rather fraternize with protesters than follow orders. It proved that the only real power left in this crumbling edifice wasn't in the Kremlin offices of Gorbachev or the shadowy bunkers of the GKCHP. It was with the elected leaders of the republics, most notably Yeltsin and Russia, and the other 14 republics. They were watching. Oh boy, were they watching. For years, they had been inching towards sovereignty, nervously testing the waters, sticking a toe out like Lithuania, getting smacked, pulling back. They had lived under the constant, paralyzing fear of Moscow's reaction. What if we declare independence? Will they send tanks? Will they cut off our heat? Will they stage a convenient internal disturbance? The August Coup answered all those questions in the most spectacular way possible. Moscow had tried to send the tanks. Moscow had tried to stage a coup. And Moscow had face-planted so hard it left an imprint on the pavement. The big bad bear wasn't just a clod, it was drunk, confused, and tripping over its own feet. The signal was loud and clear. The warden is gone. The guards are fighting amongst themselves. The main gate is wide open. Run. And run they did. What followed in the weeks after August 21st wasn't a political process, it was a jailbreak. It was the world's largest, most sudden, and most overdue mass unsubscribe event. Think of the USSR as the world's worst streaming service. Terrible content, mandatory subscription, customer service that occasionally shot you. Gorbachev had spent years promising new premium features, the new Union Treaty, to stop people from canceling. The hardliners tried to fix the service by locking everyone's accounts and sending threatening emails. The coup. And the result, everyone hit cancel subscription at the exact same time, crashed the server, and set the building on fire on their way out. Cause, the spectacular public failure of the GKCHP coup demonstrates the complete impotence of the Central Soviet government. Effect, the lingering fear of Moscow's military or KGB retribution, which had kept many republics hesitant, instantly evaporates. Consequence, republics realize this is their now or never moment to achieve full, unambiguous independence before someone, probably Yeltsin's Russia, tries to reassert control. Beat, one after another, in a dizzying cascade. Republic parliaments convene emergency sessions. Beat, they don't just declare sovereignty anymore. That was 1990s news. They declare full, complete, don't callous will call you, internationally recognized independence. Goodbye, USSR. It's been real, mostly real awful. The timeline is insane. It's like dominoes falling in fast forward. August 20th, Estonia reaffirms independence during the coup. Gutsy. August 21st, Latvia follows suit as the coup collapses. Timing August 24th, Ukraine. This is the big one. The second most populous, second most powerful republic, the breadbasket, the industrial heartland. Their parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, issues a declaration of independence, pending a referendum in December. This isn't Lithuania. This is the knockout blow. If Ukraine leaves, there is no union. Period. August 25th, Belarus. Russia's little brother, the quiet one in the back. Even they declare independence. August 27th, Moldova. They'd been effectively independent for a while, but now they make it official. August 30th, Azerbaijan, out. August 31st, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, gone. September 6th, the Soviet government itself finally, formally recognizes the independence of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Talk about closing the barn door after the horses have already emigrated and started new lives on another continent. September 9th, Tajikistan declares independence. September 21st, Armenia, after holding its own referendum, declares independence. Georgia had technically declared independence back in April, but the coup solidified it. Even Kazakhstan, led by the wily Nursultan Nazarbayev, who had played footsie with Gorbachev's Union Treaty, was now rapidly backpedaling and preparing its own exit strategy. The documentary is thick with irony. The coup was launched specifically to stop the signing of the new Union Treaty on August 20th, a treaty designed to create a looser, decentralized union of Soviet sovereign republics. The hardliners succeeded. They stopped the treaty, hooray! In its place, they got the complete and total disintegration of the country into 15 independent nations within weeks. It's like trying to stop your teenager from getting a tattoo by grounding them, and instead, they run off, join a biker gang, and get their entire face tattooed. Mission accomplished, comrades. You saved the empire by vaporizing it. Gorbachev, bless his increasingly irrelevant heart, is still wandering around the Kremlin, trying to get people interested in some kind of new treaty. A treaty for what? The furniture. He's the emperor of an empire that has evaporated. Yeltsin, meanwhile, is busy taking over the actual levers of power: the ministries, the buildings, the bank accounts within Russia. The world watches, stunned. The Soviet Union, the terrifying superpower that had dominated global politics for half a century, wasn't being defeated in a blaze of nuclear glory. It was just dissolving like a soggy paper bag in the rain, republic by republic. They were hitting unsubscribe, changing their status to single, and walking away from the world's most toxic group chat. The only question left was who would be the last one to turn out the lights. Okay, the Soviet Union is hemorrhaging republics like a slashed artery: Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. They're all out, screaming freedom, or at least anything beneficiary. But Gorbachev, bless his terminally optimistic, politically fossilized heart, is still trying to tape the patient back together. He's clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, the important republics Russia, Kazakhstan, and the big one, Ukraine, might still agree to some kind of new deal, a looser confederation, a free trade zone with a shared nuclear button, maybe just a book club, anything to avoid presiding over the complete liquidation of his historical inheritance. He was pinning his hopes on something called the Union of Sovereign States, the even weaker, sadder sequel to the already Doha Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics Treaty. He was still holding meetings, still drafting documents, still believing he could talk the tide back out, and then came December 1, 1991, and Ukraine delivered the final, definitive, soul-crushing yet. Ukraine was the whole ball game. Let's be blunt, Russia without Ukraine isn't the Soviet Union. It's just Russia, but bigger and angrier. Ukraine had the population over 50 million. The industry, the agriculture, the literal breadbasket of the empire, the strategic Black Sea ports, and, crucially, a huge chunk of the Soviet nuclear arsenal parked on its soil. If Ukraine left, the Union wasn't just weakened, it was over. It was a joke. It was a three-legged dog trying to win the Iditarod. Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, had already declared independence back on August 24th, right in the chaotic afterglow of the failed coup. But declarations are one thing. They knew they needed something more. They needed the undisputed, shoot-up Gorbachev ironclad will of the people. So they scheduled a referendum. December 1st. One question. Simple. Brutal. Number 3 to Gorbachev-esque obfuscation. Just, do you support the act of declaration of independence of Ukraine? Yes or no? The world held its breath. Gorbachev pleaded with the Ukrainian leader, Leonid Kravchuk, a slippery ex-communist apparatchik who'd suddenly discovered his inner Ukrainian patriot, to postpone the vote, to reconsider, to think of the glorious fraternal unity. Yeltsin, while publicly supporting Ukraine's right to choose, was privately hoping they'd vote no, or at least vote yes by a slim enough margin that he could still bully them into some kind of Russiadominated Slavic Union. Even George H.W. Bush, still terrified of chaos, had flown to Kyiv back in August and delivered his infamous Chicken Kiev speech, warning Ukrainians against suicidal nationalism. Smooth move, George. Telling people not to be independent usually makes them really want to be independent. The vote happened. The turnout was massive, over 84%, and the result wasn't just a yes. It was a roar. 92.3% of Ukrainians voted yes. Let that sink in. 92.3%. This wasn't a squeaker. This wasn't a divided nation. This was a national consensus so overwhelming it bordered on biological imperative. And here's the kicker that completely destroys decades of future Russian propaganda. The yes vote was massive. Everywhere. Cause the Ukrainian parliament declares independence in August but schedules a nationwide referendum for December 1st to give it unshakable popular legitimacy. Effect, despite pressure from Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and even the US. The referendum goes ahead with a simple, direct question on independence. Consequence, an overwhelming 90.3% of voters, with massive majorities in every single region, including Russian-speaking Crimea 54% and the Donbas over 80%, vote yes. Beat. This isn't just a political statement. It is a legally binding act of national self-determination that obliterates any possibility of Ukraine joining Gorbachev's Union of Sovereign States or Yeltsin's vague Commonwealth. Beat. The result effectively kills the Soviet Union on the spot. Without Ukraine, any union is a hollow shell dominated entirely by Russia, which nobody else wants. The metacometry is the sheer, beautiful, democratic power of a simple no for centuries. Ukraine had been under the thumb of Moscow, Tsarist or communist, and on December 1, 1991, millions of ordinary people walked into polling booths and, with a simple checkmark, told the empire, peacefully but unequivocally, to piss off. It wasn't tanks, wasn't coups, wasn't secret deals, it was just the vote. The most powerful weapon of all. Gorbachev heard the results and finally, seemed to understand. He later admitted that Ukraine's vote was the moment he knew it was truly over. His phone calls to Kravchuk went unanswered. His drafts for a new union treaty became worthless paper. Yeltsin heard the results and instantly pivoted. Forget saving the USSR. Forget Gorbachev. If Ukraine was out, then Russia needed to get out too, and grab as much of the furniture as possible on the way. The Ukrainian referendum didn't just kill the Soviet Union, it gave Yeltsin the green light to perform the burial. And he had just the spot picked out, a nice, quiet hunting lodge in a forest. So, Ukraine has just delivered the electoral equivalent of dropping the mic, shattering the stage, and setting the venue on fire. 92%. Independence isn't a maybe, it's a asterisk fact asterisk. Gorbachev's fantasy of a renewed union, it's not just dead, it's decomposed, fossilized, and on display in the Museum of Wishful Thinking. Boris Yeltsin, ever the opportunist, sees this not as a tragedy, but as liberation. Ukraine's no vote isn't just Ukraine leaving the USSR. It's Ukraine giving Russia permission to leave the USSR. Think about it. Yeltsin's whole game has been about building Russian sovereignty against the Soviet center run by Gorbachev. But as long as the USSR theoretically still existed, he was still technically subordinate to his arch nemesis. Ukraine just blew that whole structure apart. Yeltsin realized, why bother trying to take over the crumbling Soviet edifice? Why not just walk away, condemn the building, grab the valuables, and start fresh next door? He needed partners. He needed cover. He couldn't just unilaterally declare the USSR dead from Moscow. That would look like another coup. A Russian power grab. He needed the other big players. The ones whose departure would make the Union's demise undeniable. Who were the founding members of the original Soviet Union back in 1922? Russia, Ukraine, and Byelorussia, now Belarus. HMMM. Cue the secret rendezvous. No big Kremlin summit. No international observers. Just three guys, their entourages, and an lot of vodka, heading off to a secluded government hunting lodge deep in the Belavezha Accords, a primeval forest on the border between Belarus and Poland. It's called Vyskuly. Sounds less like the birthplace of a new world order and more like a place you'd hide a body. Which, politically speaking, is exactly what they were about to do. On December 7th and 8th, 1991, the big three Slavic musketeers gathered. Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, the swaggering, newly dominant force, Leonid Kravchuk, president of Ukraine, the wily ex-communist, now armed with that 92% mandate for independence, Stanislav Shushkevich, chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Belarus, the host, and probably the most genuinely surprised guy in the room that this was actually happening. The official story was they were meeting to discuss gas supplies, energy coordination. Utter nonsense. They were meeting to kill the Soviet Union. The meeting was apparently fueled by marathon drinking sessions and frantic back off the nap and drafting sessions by their aides. There was no grand debate about history or ideology. It was pure, brutal pragmatism. Cause. Ukraine's overwhelming independence vote makes any form of Soviet Union impossible and politically toxic. Effect: Yeltsin sees an opportunity to bypass Gorbachev completely and dissolve the USSR from the outside, alongside the other key Slavic republics. Consequence: he arranges a secret meeting with Kravchuk, Ukraine, and Shushkevich, Belarus, at a remote hunting lodge, far from Moscow's oversight. Beat: over to days fueled by significant alcohol, according to memoirs. The three leaders and their teams hammer out a simple, devastating agreement. Beat: they decide not to leave the USSR, but to declare that the USSR as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality. Ceases to exist. Cap it. Finito. Stick a fork in it. This wording was genius. They weren't seceding. They were stating a fact. The original 1922 treaty that created the USSR was being annulled by its founding members. It wasn't a divorce. It was an annulment based on the grounds that the marriage had been a terrible 70-year mistake. On December 8, 1991, the three leaders signed the document, the Belavezha Accords. It declared the USSR dead. It established, in its place, a vague, toothless entity called the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. This was the fig leaf. It sounded important, like a union, but it had no real power, no central government, no binding authority. It was basically an alumni association for ex-Soviet republics, a place to occasionally meet up, complain about Russia, and maybe coordinate who got the leftover Soviet embassies. The metacometry is staggering in its banality. The Soviet Union, the empire built on revolution, civil war, terror, and titanic sacrifice. The superpower that had faced down Hitler, launched Sputnik, and held half the world in its ideological grip, didn't die in a nuclear holocaust or a glorious final battle. It was quietly, almost casually, euthanized by three men in a hunting lodge, possibly after a few too many shots of Belaya Rus vodka, who then faxed the death certificate to the rest of the world. It was less Twilight of the Gods and more Weekend at Bernie's Soviet edition. The sheer audacity is breathtaking. They didn't even call Gorbachev first. Yeltsin, in a move of ultimate alpha dog dominance, called George H.W. Bush before he called the president of the country he had just dissolved. The transcript is amazing. Yeltsin's basically saying, "Hey George, just wanted to let you know, me and the guys killed the Soviet Union. Hope that's cool. Anyway, Gorbachev doesn't know yet, so keep it under your hat for a few hours, okay?" Bush, probably spitting out his coffee, just stammers his support. Only after confirming the US wouldn't freak out did Shushkevich, the poor guy from Belarus, get the unenviable task of phoning Gorbachev to tell him his country no longer existed. Gorbachev reportedly went ballistic, but what could he do? Issue a decree, send in the army. The army was Yeltsin's now. The decrees were meaningless. He had been bypassed. He was Emperor Palpatine finding out Luke Skywalker just signed a deal with Darth Vader to turn the Death Star into a shopping mall. Game over. So, Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich emerged from the boozy haze of the Belavezha forest, holding a piece of paper that says the USSR is cancelled. They fax it to Gorbachev metaphorically and call President Bush literally. High fives all around. But there's a slight problem. There weren't just three republics in the Soviet Union besides the already departed Baltics and stubborn Georgia. There were 11 others left standing around the wreckage, looking confused and frankly, pretty pissed off. Imagine you're the leader of, say, Kazakhstan, or Uzbekistan, or Armenia. You've been dealing with Gorbachev's endless, useless negotiations. You've been trying to figure out your own path to sovereignty. And suddenly you hear on the news that the three big Slavic dudes went camping, got drunk, and decided the entire country you live in doesn't exist anymore. And oh, by the way, they've formed a new exclusive club called the Commonwealth of Independent States, and maybe you can join later if you're cool. The reaction from the Central Asian and Caucasian republics was less hooray, freedom, and more WTF. Comrades, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the incredibly shrewd leader of Kazakhstan, was particularly irked. He'd been positioning himself as a major player, a potential power broker between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And now he finds out the empire was dissolved without him even getting an invite to the party. Hell no, this created an immediate problem for Yeltsin's grand finale. The Belavezha Accords were audacious, but they looked suspiciously like a Slavic coup. Three white, European, Christian majority republics deciding the fate of a vast, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that included 5 massive Muslim-majority republics in Central Asia. The optics were bad, Tiananmen Square bad. Yeltsin needed buy-in. He needed this Commonwealth of Independent States thing to look less like a backroom deal and more like a legitimate successor organization, even if it was designed to be useless. He especially needed the Central Asian leaders on board for one crucial reason, *nukes*. Kazakhstan had the 4th largest nuclear arsenal in the world parked on its territory, inherited from the Soviet breakup. Yeltsin needed Nazarbayev inside the tent, agreeing to some form of coordinated control. Not outside, potentially starting his own nuclear-armed Khanate. So, damage control time. The call goes out. Hey, everyone else. Sorry about that whole dissolving the Cowandy thing. Totally slipped our minds. How about we all meet up and make this official, together? The venue, Almaty, now Almaty, the capital of Kazakhstan, a neutral site. And a gesture to appease the very annoyed Nazarbayev. The date, December 21st, 1991. Just 13 days after the Vyskuly surprise party, representatives from 11 former Soviet republics show up. It's the original Belavezha 3 Russia, Ukraine, Belarus plus the 5 Central Asian republics Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. The Baltics were long gone. Georgia was in the middle of its own civil chaos and stayed away for now. The meeting wasn't about if the USSR was dead. Belavezha had already killed it. This was about agreeing on the obituary and dividing up the deceased's belongings. They signed the Almaty Protocol ***. This document formally expanded the CIS from the original 3 to these 11 founding members. It explicitly confirmed that with the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceases to exist. Double tap, make sure it's dead. Key decisions were hammered out. The CIS was **, not *** a state. It wasn't a country. It had no sovereignty. It was just a coordinating mechanism between fully independent nations. This was crucial for Ukraine, which refused to join anything resembling a new union. All members recognized existing borders. Crucial to prevent immediate border wars. Russia would inherit the USSR's permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Yeltsin grabs the biggest chair. A temporary joint command for nuclear weapons was agreed upon, essentially leaving operational control with Moscow, but requiring consultation. Everyone breathes a small sigh of relief. Let us trace the logic of this rapid expansion. Cause the Belavezha Accords, signed only by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, are seen as exclusionary and risk alienating the powerful Central Asian republics, especially nuclear Kazakhstan. Effect. Yeltsin, needing broader legitimacy and control over the Soviet military, nuclear inheritance, quickly convenes a follow-up summit in Almaty. Consequence. 8 additional republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan formally joined the CIS via the Almaty Protocol. Beat. The protocol explicitly reaffirms the dissolution of the USSR, giving it the collective stamp of approval from the vast majority of former republics. Beat. Crucially, it establishes a framework, however shaky, for managing the transition, particularly regarding nuclear weapons and Russia's assumption of the USSR's international status, preventing immediate, total chaos. The medicamentary, the CIS wasn't a marriage. It was the divorce settlement negotiation. It was created not to unite these newly independent states, but to manage their separation from the corpse of the USSR in a way that didn't immediately lead to bloodshed or accidental nuclear war. It was the political equivalent of agreeing on who gets the dog and the good silverware after the restraining order has been filed. It was an exercise in damage control, dressed up as cooperation. With the Almaty Protocol signed, the deed was done. 11 republics had now formally, collectively, declared the Soviet Union dead and buried. All that was left was for the ghost still haunting the Kremlin to finally accept his own obituary. So, the Almaty Protocol is signed, sealed, and delivered. 11 former republics have officially formed the CIS and collectively agreed. The USSR is deader than disco, for anyone keeping score. That's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, And Uzbekistan, pretty much everyone except the Baltics already gone and Georgia busy having its own internal meltdown. Back in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev is now the president. Of what, exactly? A memory. An increasingly awkward historical footnote. He still has an office in the Kremlin. He still technically holds the title president of the USSR. But the USSR, by mutual agreement of basically all its constituent parts, no longer exists. He's the captain of a ship that has already sunk, standing on the bridge, barking orders at the waves. The final days are just weird. Yeltsin's Russian government is already moving into the key Kremlin buildings, changing the stationery, measuring for new curtains. Gorbachev is a ghost haunting his own palace. He spends his time giving interviews, writing memoirs, and presumably trying to figure out how his entire life's work evaporated in the space of 4 months. The final act needed a date. Yeltsin, ever the showman, and perhaps with a dark sense of historical irony, chose December 25, 1991 Christmas Day. While the West was unwrapping presents and singing carols, the godless Soviet Empire was going to officially breathe its last. Bah! Humbug! Comrades, on that cold Moscow evening, Mikhail Gorbachev went on national television one last time. This wasn't a defiant roar. It wasn't even a sad whimper. It was the exhausted sigh of a man who knew he'd been checkmated, not just by Yeltsin, but by history itself. He looked tired. He looked resigned. He gave a 10-minute speech that was part eulogy, part job performance review, mostly positive, in his opinion, and part subtle told you so to the forces that had torn the country apart. He listed his achievements, Glasnost, ending the Cold War, nuclear disarmament, free elections, bringing the country to the threshold of freedom. He admitted mistakes, sure, but framed the overall project as a noble effort tragically derailed by uncontrollable forces. Red, Yeltsin, and nationalism. He warned of chaos, of the dangers of breaking up such a complex state. He still couldn't quite bring himself to say the words "I failed." It was more like, the experiment was a success, but then the lab blew up for reasons beyond my control. The medicamentary is thick, enough to spread on toast. Here's the man who genuinely tried to reform the unreformable, the guy who opened Pandora's box thinking it just needed a little dusting, giving his farewell address as the creatures that flew out of the box are literally dismantling the furniture behind him. He started the fire, intending just to warm the house, and seemed genuinely surprised when it burned the whole neighborhood down. He still didn't quite get that asterisk. He asterisk was the transition, not the destination. Then came the final, chillingly bureaucratic act. Sometimes shortly before or after the speech, accounts differ on the exact timing. Because why should the end be any less confusing than the rest of it? Gorbachev officially handed over the asterisk, the nuclear briefcase, the keys to Armageddon. There was no grand ceremony, no solemn procession. Reportedly, military officers simply came to his office. Gorbachev relinquished his control over the launch codes. The authority was transferred, not directly to Yeltsin in some dramatic face-off, but technically through the military command structure, which now answered to, well, Yeltsin. The ultimate symbol of Soviet power was passed like an overdue library book. Cause, with the USSR officially dissolved by the Belavezha and Almaty Accords. Gorbachev's position as president is entirely symbolic and untenable. Effect. Gorbachev agrees to formally resign and transfer power, choosing Christmas Day 1991 for the final act. Consequence. He delivers a televised resignation speech, defending his legacy, but acknowledging the end of the Union. Beat. He formally relinquishes control over the Soviet nuclear arsenal via the briefcase, transferring ultimate authority to Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia. Beat. Immediately following the speech, the physical symbols of the Soviet state are removed from the Kremlin, and then, the moment everyone was waiting for, the visual punctuation mark on 74 years of history. At 7:30 p.m. Moscow time, under the glare of television lights, watched by a stunned world, Kremlin workers lowered the flag. Not just any flag. The immense red banner, emblazoned with the gold hammer and sickle and star, that had flown over the Kremlin Senate building, the very heart of Soviet power. Slowly, almost anticlimactically, it came down, folded away, consigned to museums and history books. Moments later, another flag went up the same pole, the white, blue, and red horizontal stripes of the pre-revolutionary Russian tricolor, the flag Yeltsin had adopted for his sovereign Russia. The switch took maybe a minute. 74 years of Soviet history, erased and overwritten in 60 seconds. The empire hadn't just died. Its very symbol had been uninstalled and replaced. The ultimate, final unsubscribe. And that's how that whole mess went down. The Soviet Union, the big red machine that haunted your grandparents' dreams and fueled 1,000 spy thrillers, just stopped existing. Not with a nuclear war, not with a climactic battle, but with a series of chaotic resignations, backroom deals, a surprisingly popular vote in Ukraine, and finally, a flag swap on Christmas. Honestly, for an empire built on such dramatic flair, the ending was surprisingly bureaucratic and, let's face it, kinda lame. Just a friendly reminder, this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Seriously. Do not cite this in your history essays. Your teacher will cry, then they'll fail you, then I'll asterisk. Laugh, unless your essay is asterisk about asterisk historical absurdity, in which case, A+. So, what other historical train wrecks should we simplify and mercilessly mock next? Let us know in the comments. The Peloponnesian War is a frat rivalry. The War of Jenkins' Ear is a bar fight. Gone global, the possibilities for historical malpractice are endless. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter. Seriously, people, it's not that hard to remember.